associated with this cause for a better world for our children. It is impossible to say all I want to say and all that's relative to this study of the Commission in only 10 minutes. I will therefore provide my speaking notes to the committee, and I've also provided some documents, key documents, relevant documents that I would encourage you to study. Uh,
But I'm currently on secondment to another department. I haven't returned to the Commission due to the workplace culture and trauma from what I witnessed and experienced. But let me bring you back to the beginning of my journey with the Commission. I want to say that I fell in love with the Commission's core values and mandate. It aligned with mine in what I think to be one of my missions on Earth. I started working at the Commission in October 2019, when I first met with with leadership at the Commission and expanded on my professional and academic experiences. And especially as being fresh out of the Prime Minister's office, it was understood that I could do so much. Those coming from the PM's office typically occupy executive and management positions, much less senior advisor positions. I hold a bachelor degree in communications, a master's degree in gender studies, and I'm currently completing my doctorate studies. I have been teaching as a professor for many years now. However, despite a recognition of this reality and our discussions, I was offered a junior role on the team, an EC4 policy analyst position. I was told that they knew that this was a drastic demotion for me, but it was the only position they could offer me right away. I was frank and said that this position was not only going to prevent me from using all my talents, grow in learning, and expose myself to more opportunities, but was also restricting them in benefiting from what I could do for the Commission. I was told that once I was hired, we could then discuss more opportunities. I took the position because the cause was still and is still so important to me. But what this initial interaction would later reveal is a consistent and well-documented practice of evaluating the expertise, credentials, and professional experience of Black people at the Commission. I would quickly learn that few people were hired at such a level in my unit, that there were rarely, if ever, any open competitions for positions, and that I would be expected to do the same work as the senior advisors on the team. I faced intersectional forms of discrimination. For instance, when I approached the acting director of the policy team to discuss acting opportunities, they speculated that I had my hands full at home because of my children and to maybe reconsider wanting to seek higher opportunities. I was also told by the director that I did not demonstrate having enough experience debriefing senior management. To that, I responded, "How more senior than the Prime Minister of Canada and his team do you want?" The Commission systemically abuses staffing processes to reward certain behaviors, promote certain individuals almost exclusively without competition, and to inflate the levels of positions. There are no avenues for meaningful career development for Black employees, regardless of their contributions. The institution relies on non-advertised processes to create advantage for some and disadvantage for others. It wasn't until I was going to engage the union that I was offered an acting for 4 months. For 4 months. When the time came, I was told I would actually have to compete for the position, but watch colleagues quietly promoted without competitions, sometimes several levels up. How could I compete if the organization never holds competitions? Please note that I never asked for any favor. Black people are not asking for favors. We are often overqualified, have multiple degrees, are bilingual, or speak more than 2 languages, like me. I have extensive work experience, yet we are underclassified and are not given fair opportunities. I met with senior management. To them, I outlined the violence that was happening within the CHRC's walls. Just like so many have done before, they took the information, kept asking me and other Black employees to tell them and senior leadership our trauma. but continued and still continue to bring performative actions to hide what is actually systemically happening at the Commission. When I started attending meetings at the Commission, I quickly started witnessing troubling behaviors. The dismissal of race complaints and the normalization of racist and sexist narratives are unfortunately not uncommon occurrences at the Commission. I sat at tables where I heard dehumanizing conversations from people that are in charge of assessing complaints. It was shocking to see that all four investigation managers were white, with the exception of one employee, and that the entire team of investigators handling complaints filed on the ground of race, color, national and ethnic origin, and religion was white, and they did not have relevant experience regarding race-based discrimination. Long before any investigation took place, it was commonplace for staff to speculate about how a complainant is imagining things. It couldn't possibly be about race. They must be lying. Prejudging the outcome of a complaint is sadly normalized among all grounds, but the insidiousness of racism meant that almost every race-based complaint I saw was dismissed, irrespective of the evidence presented. In a workplace where discrimination and racism is present, I felt marginalized, isolated, unsupported, and excluded. I know that this is what created and continues to create feelings of anxiety, stress, and trauma. The impact of racism is far-reaching and long-lasting. It affected my physical and mental health. I left the Commission on sick leave in September 2020. I was then pregnant with my third child and was worried at how stress and violence experienced in the workplace was negatively affecting my pregnancy. I ended up giving birth earlier than the due date, which has never happened to me in all my previous pregnancies. Many of those who have spoken out over the years continue to suffer and are too afraid to speak up. They have suffered from mental health issues such as depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation, career loss, stagnation, and exclusion from development opportunities has intergenerational trauma, intergenerational effect for families. Some quit the public service and have had to navigate the job market during a pandemic without references as a consequence of speaking up for Canadians. It is not easy to speak up against an institution such as the Commission, especially in a world where anti-Black racism exists in almost all communities and is so normalized that it is rendered invisible to most. I will be making several recommendations in my brief, but today I want to speak to a few. I support the recommendations made by experts and witnesses to reform Canada's human rights system by facilitating a direct access model for complaints to the tribunal. Every Canadian deserves to have their complaints considered in a fair and timely manner and by an independent body with the means to effectively resolve them. The Commission requires a complete overhaul of workplace review, including limiting its mandate to public education, outreach, and policy support. There also need to be accountability for those who have abused the system and harmed Canadians. We now have a finding of discrimination and evidence of the disproportionate dismissal of race complaints. There should be consequences for those in leadership who committed, enabled, and promoted a culture of disregard for human rights of employee and the public. Lastly, I believe that it is time for Canada to embark on a path of reconciliation with people of African descent and to contend with its own history of enslavement, segregation, and marginalization. We need national legislation and a policy framework that formally recognizes people of African descent in Canada as a distinct group whose human rights must be promoted and protected. to advance protected. A course of reconciliation with people of African descent require an apology, public education, and the preservation of records of historical injustices, including slavery, segregation, and its impact. To advance substantive equality, it must require the implementation of corrective measures, a robust framework for results and public reporting, and facilitate consequential amendments to existing legislation and regulations to remove barriers, eradicate anti-Black racism, and address disparities in outcomes. To conclude, Madame la Présidente, sénatrice
Chair, senators,
et à la maison,
those listening and here and at home,
more and allow people to continue performative allyship. As a Black mother, as a Black woman, as a mother, as a professional, and as an academic, I contribute to this country and make it a better place to be. On behalf of Black people in this country and around the globe, we deserve equitable treatment. We deserve the spaces we occupy and to exist in the skin that we are in. We deserve compassion and to be celebrated, to experience joy, abundance, prosperity. We are intelligent, strong, resilient, and talented. We will not tolerate being dehumanized anymore. To this I say, Ubuntu. I am because we are. Thank you. Merci. Akiba.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Betchi, for your presentation. Thank you for your courage, and thank you for sharing your story with us. I will now turn to the senators to ask questions. We have a list already. But before asking and answering questions, I would like to ask committee members and witnesses in the room for the duration of this meeting to please refrain from leaning in too close to the microphone or remove your earpiece when doing so. This will avoid any sound feedback that could negatively impact the committee staff in the room. So I will turn to the Deputy Chair, Senator Bernard, for her question, to be followed by Senator Jaffer.
Thank you, Chair. I want to start, Bernadette, by applauding you for your resilience and thanking you for your courage. I know that it takes a lot of courage to come into a public space such as this, to talk about the trauma that you've experienced, and also the racism that you've experienced and witnessed. And I know that you're not just speaking of your own story. This is not just your story. This is a story of many, many people. I have far too many questions, so
I will give my time to you, Senator Bernard.
I'll put myself on the second round. There's so much in what you've shared with us. But I think the first question I want to ask you is, what consequences would you think would be appropriate for the finding of the recent grievance that you and others put forward? You talked about there should be consequences. What's the scope of consequences that you're thinking about?
Thank you so much. Can you hear me? I'm never sure. I see red here. Okay. Thank you so much for your question, Senator. And I would start by saying that people that caused harm need to be held accountable. They should have the humility to step down their positions and leave the room for people that can come and solve all the problems and fix all the problems that they have caused by perpetuating violence in many ways. So I think that would be a very important one. The structural and systemic changes that we're also asking the reform of the commission is another important one to note. But I believe that at this moment, the actions that we are bringing to the commission will only go forward if the people that have perpetuating the harm um, are removed from the positions, and then we have folks um, that will come and expert with their expertise will come with a new lens and meaningful and intentional actions to actually bring, the reform that is intended to, that we would like to see at the Human Rights Commission. So I think these are the two recommendations that I would like to focus on.
Thank you. Could I do a follow-up to that question and just ask, so you noted that you're on secondment. What would need to change at the commission for you to go back there? What would make that a workplace that you'd want to return to?
I believe a big part of why I don't feel safe at the commission is the people in senior leadership. I trusted them with my story. I went to them to explain what was happening to me and other of my colleagues. And just like others, they took that story and used it, but didn't do anything. There's no meaningful actions that followed up me sharing my story with them. So I believe that it will be a triggering place to me until these people no longer work there.
I'll just ask one more question for now, and then I'll give my colleagues an opportunity. So you use the term violence to refer to racism, and not many Canadians would frame racism as a form of violence. But of course, we have research that has documented racism as a form of violence. Can you tell us a bit more about that and why you would frame the racism that you've experienced and witnessed as a form of violence?
Thank you for that question. And to better answer that question, I need to say that this is my interpretation of, racism. And if you were to ask someone else, another Black person, maybe they would answer something else. But this is what I'm going to tell you. I have been experiencing racism since the day I arrived in this country. I was 3 years old. Racism for Black people is at school, at the grocery store. It's, soccer field, at the park. It's at and now in the workplace. I have internalized so many of the words that have been spoken to me, so many of the violent words that have been spoken to me. And those words play in my head day in and day out, even though I know my worth because of the racism I have experienced my entire life. There's so much harm, that I caused to myself because of internalized racism. So it's psychological, it's harm that you can not always see physically, but it is internalized. So that is why I refer to racism as violent.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Jaffer to be followed by Senator Arnett.
Thank you very much, Chair. And Ms. Betchi, I thank you. And I follow Senator Bernard when she said you're courageous. I agree, you're courageous. And by being here today, you're not just asking to protect your children, but you're asking for all our children to be protected. And I salute you because many of us have gone through racism, and even in this institution, but we are not as brave as you. So when I say to you that you're brave, it comes from the bottom of my heart. And thank you. And I don't know where to start. I'm in the same position as my friend, my colleague, Senator Bernard. But I want to start with, after I listen to you, and I look at somebody who's worked at PMO. So you're not a shrinking violet. You're not somebody who doesn't know our system or doesn't know how to work it. And yet you are sitting here in front of us and you're telling us these things. And it sort of takes my breath away. But I have a question for you. Given what you have said and your experiences and the internal culture, do you even think if reform is possible, or we need a fundamental change in structure of this department? And you have made recommendations, but when I'm hearing from you, I'm just thinking, is it even possible? Is it even possible to change the toxic culture?
Thank you for that question. It's a loaded question. And I guess I'm going to start by saying this. If I didn't have hope, I wouldn't be sitting here. Hope is what is, at the core of my body. And that is why I am fighting for all of our kids and all of us. So we need to have hope that change can happen. So change at the commission can happen. But there's a few recommendations that I provided, and like I said, there's more detailed recommendations in the brief documents that I provided.
I read that, but not so much looking at recommendations because you already made it, and I don't want to take your or my time on
Yeah.
that. But what I was wondering, after hearing what you say, and you've been at PMO, and there's, is this environment more toxic than what was? Not that I'm saying that PMO has got
Mhm.
racist issues,
Mhm.
but it's a tough environment to work in.
Absolutely.
So I just
And the commission, I can testify that the commission is way more toxic than any other places I've worked in at before. So I can say that. Now, if we go and proceed with the structural changes and remove the people that are leading that institution, I think that there's hope that we can bring true and meaningful reform.
Well, I'm going to ask you that from what I hear from you, it's
Yes.
pretty, it's everywhere, right? It's not just the leadership. The leadership is based on a foundation of
Absolutely,
racism, right?
yeah.
So you think just removing the leadership would do it?
So
Because it's ingrained everywhere.
it is ingrained everywhere. It is ingrained at the commission. It is ingrained. It's systemic. That is the problem. Is that systemic racism is part of the system. The system is created like that, and is created in a way that folks are only, I guess, individuals perpetuating this what's embedded in the system. So. Removing a few key players is a way that we can advance, and then we need to work, we need to educate the public. There's so many other things that also need to accompany the reform, but I would say that because it's in the system, we also need to focus on changing the system.
So having worked at PMO, did you contact anybody at PMO to talk to them about your terrible situation?
I didn't contact anybody, at PMO to explain, and a lot of them, most of them, learned about this situation like everybody else on the media.
Second round, please. Thank you.
Senator Arnett, to be followed by Senator Jobe.
Well, thank you, witness, and thank you for your courage. I think it's echoed by all the senators that have heard you testify here today. I have a very similar question to the one raised by my colleague, Senator Jaffer, because you've described an experience of being marginalized, an experience of sadness, anger, an experience of anxiety, stress, trauma in what seems to be a thoroughly toxic environment. It actually paints a very bleak picture. So I know you have some hope, but I really question whether there is anything that can be done to restore the trust and confidence that Black Canadians would have in the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And I hear that you have some hope in that regard with a structural reform, deconstructing the commission, some of the processes, the leadership, and perhaps new leadership and new people are required because of the deep-seated cultural bias that appears to be part of your evidence, but also part of the evidence of others that have come before us. So I'd like you to comment on that. And secondly, would it be fair to say that we can assume that the same kind of systemic discrimination that has occurred at the Canadian Human Rights Commission is in fact occurring in most of the ministries and agencies of the federal government.
I will start by answering your second question. My story is not a unique story. From me at the Canadian Human Rights Commission to any departments across the public service and in private sectors. So I am here. You hear my voice, but I'm speaking on behalf of everybody, all the other Black people, all other Black people that have experienced have similar realities as mine. I'm here representing so many people. So it happened at the commission and it happens in so many other departments. I would say all the departments. Now, to go back to your first question. So the reason why I bring hope in here is because if I don't have hope, then what else do we have? Okay, I don't think that the commission is capable of change or even reform in a way that's meaningful, but then we need to try. That's why I bring hope into this.
Second row, please.
Followed by Senator Omidwar.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. Thank you, Bernadette, for your testimony. It's very powerful, and it corroborates all we've heard in the past in the context of this study. And thank you for your presence here. And I'm sorry that this toxic environment at the Commission caused an early birth, premature birth. And the reform that you envisage for the Commission, what would it look like? Would there have to be more upper level persons in positions who are Black, people who understand the environment and the context faced by Black employees and incoming Black employees, and how there are those who have suggested dissolving the Commission, and yet many people think that there might be more reforms that might be possible. Thank you very much for your question. I would say that there are a number of aspects to the reform that I would like to see at the Commission. First of all, I was talking about the problem of systemic racism. So the system has been created in a way that people are perpetuating this systemic discrimination and racism. And I think hiring more Black managers, I think this is an interesting proposal because I would say that I've often been disappointed by Black persons who are in management positions and who seem to have forgotten what happens. Maybe they were worried about keeping their job, or maybe they're afraid. And I can't really say what their reasons were. Their struggle stops at the door of their office and doesn't continue in their position as managers. They forget us. And the people who should be in these roles must be people who represent us and who have the courage to continue to fight for Black employees, to put a stop to this discrimination, systemic discrimination against Black people. That's the first thing. And then there's just been someone named, appointed to a post. I think that Often this is for appearances and and I think there must be concrete work with regard to eliminating discrimination. I think this direct model that was discussed last week with regard to the tribunal uh, would be a way of uh, uh, breaking away from the Commission's control over complaints heard by the Commission. So there should be a direct method or direct uh, pathway towards a hearing. And I think that just appointing someone to a leadership position and just appointing someone who's black, that's not enough. That person and their team must be ready to bring about real change. Up until now, when these people are appointed, they forget us afterwards. Next round, please.
Yes, you can ask your question.
Dans le cadre,
In the current situation, your current situation, and any what is underway right now. Well, my complaint to the Human Rights Commission, and I am part of the class action. Thank you.
Thank you, Chair, and I join my colleagues in thanking you for being here, for educating us today, and you're doing so at some significant risk to yourself, I imagine. So thank you for that. My question is on leadership. Seems to be the strand that my colleagues are exploring. You said in your testimony that key players need to be removed. But when key players are removed, new players are put in place. And I wonder if you would comment on the Canadian Human Rights Act itself, which mandates 6 commissioners to be named by the Governor and Council, including the Chief Commissioner and a Deputy Chief Commissioner, members referred to as the Accessibility Commissioners and Pay Equity Commissioners. There is nothing in the Act that refers to the commissioners being from the designated groups themselves. Women, persons with disabilities, Aboriginal peoples, invisible minorities, and of course there's intersection between these. Do you believe that the government should amend the Canadian Human Rights Act to ensure that there is, as you said, both experience and competency, as well as the perspectives of marginalized groups at the leadership table, so that you don't have processes such as what you called, how can you compete when there's no official competition? This goes to leadership, don't comes from the top.
I thank you, Senator, and I believe that you answered your powerful question when you said, I believe that there needs to be designated, and I forget exactly how you stated it, but how you said it, but there needs to be, and the words are not coming, but there needs to be a people appointed, designated equity-seeking groups. They need to be at the head. So, like you said, it trickles down at the bottom in the processes, the structure, the conversations. The conversations at the commission will change if there's people around the table that know what they're talking about. So, yes, my answer is very short because you did answer. In your statement, you did answer your own question. I would say yes. I think there needs to be that change, and there needs to be people appointed at those positions.
Thank you very much. We'll add it to your list of recommendations, and we look forward to receiving the brief. I'm curious for you to compare the political sandbox with the public service sandbox. You know, it kind of stuns me, frankly. But can you describe your trajectory to the PMO's office? We've heard your trajectory at the public service, but can you describe that trajectory and compare some key moments?
So when you say explain, meaning my educational background, everything that led me there, or what do you mean?
How did you get to be at the PMO? And how do you compare and contrast that with your journey to the public service?
So I want to say, first of all, that any of the positions that I occupied and I had the opportunity to, to be in, I worked extremely hard to get there. I also want to say that I'm educated. And I don't always start by saying that because I believe that I'm a person first, but we have learned that education is important. We see it in, needs to require a bachelor degree. Well, I have almost a doctorate degree. So I'm educated. I speak multiple languages. I am someone who works for the community. I'm a community builder. That is how I got to PMO. I want to bring change. I want to work for the other. I love the other. I love people. I want to bring change. I'm thinking that in a way, I'm trying to heal myself from everything I have experienced as a Black person. And I do that by helping others because I don't want them to suffer like I have suffered and I continue to suffer. That is how I got to PMO, is by telling people that maybe if I'm in that space, I can bring change. So I was hired at PMO and I worked there and eventually decided to leave. I told you I have a growing family. My children were young. And I don't need to teach you anything, how demanding this work is. When you work in politics, it's 24 hours, 7 days a week. And it is a tough place to be, but we need to be in these spaces. So I was there and I loved my experience. And maybe when my children are grown, I will be coming back. I went to the public service. By the way, I left the public service already 3 times because I keep experiencing racism everywhere I go. So I left and I came back and I left again because I think it's going to change this time. And then I come back and I leave again. So I've been working at the, I started working in the public service in 2009. Started as an administrative assistant, worked there a few years, went into politics at the PMO, and then after my time there, came back to the public service, but had left already once, and then I came back. So coming back to the core of your question, the differences, existing in a Black body in any spaces we go is difficult. Let me say that. And then you can, receive it the way you want to receive it, but existing in this body is not easy anywhere you go. I would have stayed if it wasn't for external factors at the PMO, but I decided to go back to the public service and to the commission, which, like I said at the beginning, had the core values are embedded in my heart. But again, I've been disappointed. So the differences, I'm not sure, but I would say to exist in a Black body in any spaces we go is an act of resilience on its own.
Thank you. I know I said I wasn't going to ask a question, but a very, very brief one because we have a long list of senators on. second round. I want to take you back to the day with you started working at the Human Rights Commission, the first time you had an incident of racism. What was your reaction? Like, I mean, and you know, something you said really resonated with me, that you worked very hard to get where you are. And I think a lot of us sitting here at this table can agree with that. I know that I keep pushing myself. I feel I have to keep proving myself as a racialized person. So I can understand, you know, when you say that. But I just, after all, you're working at the Canadian Human Rights Commission and you're experiencing racism. What was your reaction?
The first time that it happened, I am rarely speechless. I was speechless. I could not believe what I was hearing. So at myself for not saying anything, because that's what happens. You sit at those tables and you're the only Black person. If you say something, it's because you're angry. If you say something, it's because, you know, but how you're always questioned. How do you know it was racism? Why is it always a race card? How can you make so? I didn't say anything because it's the last place I thought I would be hearing anything to that regard. So the first time, I remember having a conversation with my manager after telling that person, I cannot believe what I heard. That person told me that it's not the first time that, you know, um, and the second time that I witnessed, though, I was prepared mentally and physically to say something. And ever since, I have been saying something. But when you say things, people don't like you. They don't invite you at tables where decisions are made. You're not privy of, they cut you off of conversations. Um, you hear after the fact. So there's many things that come after you speaking up. So, but I was completely speechless, Senator.
Thank you. So, senators, we have 10 minutes left, and I have 4 senators on second round. So, if we can keep our questions and answers to 2 minutes, I would really appreciate that. So, Senator Bernard, to be followed by Senator Jaffer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you so much. There's one other point I want to get on the record. You talked about a path of reconciliation for African Canadians in this country, and you talked about an apology. When Canada signed on to the UN Decade for People of African Descent, they did not issue an apology. When Canada recognized Emancipation Day for the first time in 2021, they fell short of issuing an apology. And a group in Nova Scotia, the Nova Scotia, a decade for people of African descent, have twice launched a petition calling for an apology, and we've not received one. African Canadians have not received an apology for the history and legacy of enslavement in this country. In July of 2022, we had an apology to the descendants of the No. 2 Construction Battalion. And I recall speaking at that event and saying at that time, more apologies are due. More apologies are due. And we've not had one. It sounds to me like you're saying a path of reconciliation can only happen if there's an apology. And so I'm wondering if you would give us a comment on that. And if you could comment on why you think there's such reluctance in this country to offer an apology to African people, to Black people, for not only the legacy of enslavement of our ancestors, but the ongoing persistence of anti-Black racism.
Thank you for your question, Senator. I will say that because Black people are not recognized as humans. We're treated as second-class citizens. That is why it is so hard. If you believe that I'm a human too and I deserved love and respect, it will be easy for you to give me an apology. That's how I see this. Um, that's how I raise my children, right? It's easy to apologize when you respect someone, when you want the best for them. I said in my speaking notes, I said performative actions. I use that key term, and that is what's been happening. A lot of performativity, symbols, but with no substance behind. There's a lot of words, no actions behind. There's a lot of, oh, we are going to come and show up in public space. So the public, Canadians can say that we were there, but then we hear nothing after. That's what we want. Concrete actions. And we want to an apology. Many apologies, I would say, because there's many things to apologize for. So apologies. That's a good start. Then we'll see.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Jaffer, to be followed by Senator Arnett.
Thank you, Chair. Thanks for giving me this opportunity again. And I meant to say this earlier and I forgot. For all those who are here with you, if it wasn't for you, Ms. Betchi would probably not be here. So your support also we appreciate it because support to all of us. So thank you very much for being here. We all have so many questions, but time has run out. But I want to say to you that since you went public and bravely started speaking about racism and the toxic environment at the Human Rights Commission, have you received support and has the union been supporting you? Has your union been supporting you?
So my journey of going public started in 2020 when I came out with for the Black Class Action Suit. So I have been on this journey since 2020. The collective, the community. So I will say my parents, my siblings. I'm one of 5 and I have the best siblings. My friends, I have an amazing village that is taking care of me and my children. They could do better. And I think it's a lesson for any unions, really. You need to go to your Black employees and ask them how you can provide support. They have, it sometimes takes time, but they have. And I now can say that they are asking me how they can help me. Again, ask me, ask another person, might be different, but I can feel now the support. But I believe that it took some time.
But what about fighting for you with the commission? That's more important.
That is more important. Absolutely. That is more important.
Have they done it?
So again, I think that it's in how they've done and maybe what they think is important or was important or how to
But
do
they
things.
haven't done it.
I don't want to say they have not done it. I want to say there's different things that they still can be doing.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Senator Arnett.
Thank you. No, that's okay. Thank you.
Thank you, witness. You've spoken at other times about the need for an independent review to do an in-depth analysis of the problem that you're describing and come up with very strategic recommendations for change. Are you still calling for that? Is that, can you just amplify some of the things that you would like to see because as a benefit to Canada.
Absolutely. So we are asking, and when I first came public with this news, I said that we're asking for an expert to go in the commission and do an internal investigation. That expert absolutely needs to be a Black person with anti-Black racism knowledge, which has not happened. And the report that comes out of it needs to be public to all of us. No hiding anything, no secrets. So that is something that we're asking.
Okay. Thank you.
The final question, Senator Sherwood.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I think that Senator Arnott asked the question I wanted to ask. You know that today you've made a number of recommendations, and we need these recommendations, and that will help us a great deal in preparing our report at the conclusion of this review, because we will be writing a report on what we've heard. And if you had one recommendation, important recommendation amongst all those you're recommending, would to ensure that your work will have been efficient and effective. Thank you. This is an important question, and this effort is not only for me; it's for all those like me, and the important thing is to allow complaints to go straight to the tribunal, so that all Canadians will be able to obtain justice. And that's what we're working for here. And that would be what I would recommend. Thank you.
I want to thank you, like I said, for your courage, for coming and sharing your stories. And you know what, people watching, they will have the courage to speak out when they're confronted with racism. We really appreciate your help in helping us with this study. Senators, we'll take a 10-minute break just to get ready for the next panel.
We have a breaking story to tell you about this hour. CBC News has learned that Black members of the civil service, the Canadian Public Service, both current and former members, have launched a lawsuit against the government, alleging decades of discrimination that kept them from advancing in their careers.
The suit aims to represent tens of thousands of employees alleging decades of anti-Black discrimination.
The class action lawsuit alleges systemic discrimination toward Black public employees, specifically that they faced discrimination in the hiring process and when up for promotions dating back to the 1970s.
Make no mistake, this is a major development, a significant, a landmark case, $900 million that has implications for organizations and institutions across the country.
An internal review has found that Canada's human rights watchdog discriminated against its own employees. Well, tonight, some of them are speaking exclusively to David Thurton about the racism they experienced.
I had never had the privilege.
Bernadeth Betchi wants the public to know about the hurt she and other Black civil servants endured.
Sadness, anger, exhaustion. Having to prove that Black bodies are worthy of human is exhausting.
Betchi worked at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the arm's-length federal body that's supposed to investigate discrimination.
I would describe the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the environment, the workplace, as toxic, poisonous. It has affected my mental and physical well-being and health, and I'm not the only one.
Betchi and 8 others filed a complaint alleging discriminatory practices, including that race-based complaints were often dismissed by all white investigative teams, that when she and her colleagues spoke up, colleagues demeaned them, and that Black employees were excluded in career advancement. The federal government's human resource arm agreed the commission did discriminate against its own workers.
If the commission itself is guilty of discriminatory practices, really what chance do Canadians have to rely on the commission to protect them from discriminatory practices?
I don't recommend anyone that is Black, racialized, or again, from any religious minority group to file a complaint at the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
That's why Betchi wants a third-party investigation by someone experienced in anti-Black racism.
They need to come and investigate anti-Black racism within the commission.
In a statement, the commission says it accepts the findings. It says it's committed to anti-racism, but won't comment further because the matter is before mediation. Justice Minister David Lametti says the findings are disappointing and concerning. David Thurton, CBC News, Ottawa.
Public service unions are pressing the federal government to stop court action and settle the Black class action lawsuit. The lawsuit covers 30,000 Black civil servants. It seeks $2.5 billion in damages. The lawsuit alleges Black civil servants were not given the opportunity for promotion because of discrimination. CTV's Colton Prale live with more on this. Colton?
Graham, the latest push to drop court action against the lawsuit comes on the heels of a significant finding that the Canadian
Public service unions are pressing the federal government to stop court action and settle the Black class action lawsuit. The lawsuit covers 30,000 Black civil servants. It seeks $2.5 billion in damages. The lawsuit alleges Black civil servants were not given the opportunity for promotion because of discrimination. CTV's Colton Prale live with more on this. Colton?
Graham, the latest push to drop court action against the lawsuit comes on the heels of a significant finding that the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the federal body whose mandate is to protect equal opportunity, discriminated against Black and racialized employees. The lawsuit alleges that for 5 decades, tens of thousands of Black employees have been passed over for promotion or lost out on opportunities as a result of their race. The union says the recent findings that even employees within the federal government's human rights watchdog faced systemic anti-Black racism, sexism, and systemic discrimination show the bureaucratic systems in place are failing racialized employees.
We have workers who've served Canada diligently for 30 years, 40 years, 50 years, and have retired in the same position or is retiring in the same.
The unions say the planned lawsuit is needed to ensure systematic changes rather than individual solutions. Meanwhile, the federal government is asking the courts to dismiss the lawsuit, arguing the employees are unionized and should use the grievance process instead to seek solutions. Graham.
All right, CTV's Colton Prale.
Back in this country, plans to develop a mental health program specifically for Black federal civil servants appears to be in jeopardy tonight. As David Thurton shows us, some have written a letter saying they're dealing with anti-Black racism during the process.
Why should it be me?
Ketlin Pierre shares one of the lowest points in her life and career as a federal civil servant.
One of them is an employee who came to my office, and then she drew a monkey on my pad and made sure that I knew it was my image and I should be cleaning instead of doing management work.
Pierre says the existing mental health supports like a hotline are not enough to help her and other Black employees.
The budget documents for 2022.
Earlier this year, the Liberals committed to a mental health action plan for Black employees. Now, it could be on the verge of falling apart. The Federal Black Employee Caucus says it's rethinking its involvement. This after senior Treasury Board officials allegedly questioned the need for a program designed for and led by Black employees. CBC News obtained a letter from the group to the Treasury Board. While short on details, it says, "We showed up to support the Government of Canada to address anti-Black hate within the public service, only to be continuously faced with the crushing weight of it."
When I first read this letter, it was appalling, shocking, it was hurtful.
A plaintiff in a proposed class action lawsuit brought by Black federal government employees says he spoke to workers involved.
They tell me how sometimes they were left in tears. They've had to turn off the camera on the team's meeting and just break down in tears because of the anti-Black racism that they are facing from the senior leaders at the Treasury Board.
In a statement, the Treasury Board says it cannot comment about the mental health program for federal Black employees because it's before cabinet. But it says the federal government is committed to inclusion and diversity. David Thurton, CBC News, Ottawa.
My name is Caroline Lane. I've done a total of 37 years with the RCMP. I never got a promotion. The biggest challenge I faced was many people didn't really acknowledge me. If someone come into the room and I am there, they would ask me, oh, can I speak to somebody about certain things? And I says, well, you can talk to me. I'm the somebody. And they would say, oh, isn't there somebody else over you? Why even look for a promotion? Because around the room, within the RCMP, when I was hired, I was the only, if you should use the word, Black person working there. I never got that opportunity to supervise anyone. Not that I didn't know the job. Not receiving the promotion made me upset over the years because I've noticed so many others come in that didn't have the experience that I have. One superintendent had needed a secretary, and I figure I can do that job. And I voiced my opinion that I wanted that job. I learned that that superintendent said he didn't want a Black girl to be working there because when the other members and officers, everybody comes in, they would see the first person who would greet them would be the Black girl. I had to work 3 times harder than the other girls in the office. You don't just look at somebody and because of the skin color, you say, she's Black, I'm not going to take her. If they have the credentials and if they have the capabilities, why not? Why not give that person an opportunity? Treat every individual as a human being.
Hi, my name is Selena Caesar Chavan. I am a consultant and advisor. I was a former member of parliament for the town of Whitby, former parliamentary secretary to the Prime Minister, and parliamentary secretary to international development. I first heard about the Black class action lawsuit through social media, and to be honest, was really intrigued because it sort of was a continuation from my previous role in the fact that as a member of parliament, my job was really to advocate for equity and to ensure that we were looking after the most vulnerable in our society. And then I had a few people coming into my office who worked for the public service, and they described these stories to me. But you could see the pain in their faces about the years that they put in, the amount of times they got passed over for jobs, and it hurt me. My last act as a member of parliament was tabling a bill that would force the public service to look at the barriers that existed for promotion within the public service, particularly for Black individuals. It was Bill 468. When we look at the DEI, the diversity, equity, and inclusion framework, that Black people tend not to be benefactors of the strides that we've made around diversity and inclusion. Someone who works for civic engagement is a public servant who is taking care of the well-beings of Canadians, that at the very least we treat them with dignity. We make that space equitable. We have some humanity built into that space. And when you hear these stories from the nucleus of our country, then what does that say to the rest of us and to the rest of our institutions? I support all Black workers who are seeking justice through this class action suit. Why do we need to do this now? Because the urgency of now demands that we do it right now.
Witnesses have been asked to make an opening statement of 5 minutes. We shall hear from the witnesses and then have questions from the senators. With us in person at the table, I wish to welcome from the Canadian Human Rights Commission, Charlotte Ann Malashevsky. I hope I got that right. I tried. Malashevsky. She's accompanied by Ian Fine, who's the Executive Director, and Holly Holton, who's the Director General and Senior General Counsel. I will now invite Ms. Malashevsky to make her opening statement.
Good evening, honorable senators. Thank you for the invitation to appear before your committee. As the senator indicated, I'm joined today by my colleagues Ian Fine, our Executive Director, and Holly Holtman, our Senior General Counsel and Director General of Legal Services. We are humbled to gather on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe Nation, in this territory now known as Ottawa. As Canada's national human rights institution, the Commission has long acknowledged that systemic anti-Black racism is real in Canada. No organization is immune, and it is up to all of us to uncover and reject all forms of racism and discrimination whenever they arise. And that is exactly what the Commission is doing and will continue to do. We are committed to doing what is necessary to ensure that everyone in Canada can trust in the Commission to conduct its work with integrity and accountability. The Canadian Human Rights Commission sincerely apologizes for any instances in which we fell short of our obligations, whether as an employer or service provider. The Commission does not tolerate racism of any kind in our workplace. We are committed to providing our employees with psychologically healthy, safe, and respectful environment to do their important work. We are fully prepared to undergo an independent third-party workplace assessment, and we welcome a discussion of reforms to the Canadian Human Rights Act. We also understand that the Treasury Board Secretariat decision have raised questions about the Commission that cannot go unanswered. In July 2020, 9 Black and racialized employees wrote a letter raising concerns about racism and discrimination in the workplace and how the Commission had been reviewing race-based complaints. This formed the basis of the policy grievances the unions filed that same year. In March 2023, the Treasury Board Secretariat released its decisions in the policy grievances. They found a breach of the no discrimination clauses in the respective collective agreements and no breaches of the other clauses cited. The Commission fully accepted the Treasury Board's decisions and acknowledged to our staff and the public the very difficult fact that employees experienced discrimination in our workplace. We have until now refrained from commenting on specific instances in the workplace based on our obligations to protect the privacy of all those involved. We recognize now we must go further. Here's what I can tell you. There were situations in our complaint services branch in which employees responded in unprofessional and disrespectful ways to the contributions their Black and racialized colleagues made at work. This had a profound negative impact, which we deeply regret and apologize for. Let me be clear. When this happened in 2020, the Commission took prompt and appropriate corrective action to address the misconduct. But we did not stop there. Over the last nearly 3 years, we also took Commission-wide action to ensure that we are addressing the full scope of the concerns raised. The Treasury Board acknowledged these positive actions in its decisions and did not order us to do more. On the recommendation of the signatories to the letter, the Commission worked with an external independent facilitator, Arlene Huggins, to create a confidential forum for employees to share their experiences. The Commission also developed a comprehensive anti-racism action plan based on Ms. Higgins' recommendations and input from employees, unions, stakeholders, and external experts. Every Commission executive is accountable for implementing this plan, and that is assessed in their yearly performance evaluations. There are 23 people on the Commission's executive team. 83% of those executives belong to one or more of the 4 employment equity groups. 35% of the Commission's executive team are Black, racialized, or Indigenous. And as part of our anti-racism action plan, we provided Commission-wide training to increase awareness and discussion around anti-Black racism and the impacts of systemic racism, colonialism, and trauma. We provided psychological supports, including a dedicated trauma-informed counselor available to employees. We established the Decolonization and Anti-Racism Consultation Committee, made up of Black, racialized, and Indigenous employees, as a forum for ongoing employee engagement, feedback, and accountability related to all aspects of our work. We struck a network for advancing racial equality to engage external Black and racialized stakeholders and rights holders in our work. We worked with the former Vice Chair of the Human Rights Tribunal of Ontario to review how we handled race-based complaints and implemented his recommendations, which included revising our tools and approaches. We continue to use non-advertised appointments, acting opportunities, and other flexible approaches to support our Black, racialized, and Indigenous employees' career development and progression. The Commission has already seen meaningful results. Since 2018, the Commission has reduced the dismissal rate for race-based complaints from 26% to 9% and increased the rate at which race-based complaints are referred to the tribunal from 6% in 2018 to 21% in 2022. And we are staying involved to make crucial legal arguments and present evidence in 93% of the race-based complaints that are before the tribunal. We have also heard testimony of witnesses about the need to reform the Canadian Human Rights Act and the Employment Equity Act. We echo many of those concerns. In fact, for years, we've been advocating for many of the changes they have called for. In closing, the people who work at the Commission are a diverse group of people, many of whom have lived experiences of the very kinds of discrimination that the Canadian Human Rights Act exists to protect. They are dedicated individuals who care deeply about uncovering and eliminating discrimination and racism in all its forms. We are coming together to heal and effect change within our organization. Thank you. We look forward to your questions.
Thank you for your presentation. We would proceed to questions from senators, and as our previous practice, you'll have 5 minutes for your questions, and that includes the answer. But before we go to the other senators, I'm going to ask a question. You heard some of the testimony you've been following. We heard the CHRC is incapable of change, and I've heard words from you today, appropriate corrective action taken. Can you share with us what that means? We heard about flexible approaches to support Black and racialized and Indigenous employees, and you have already seen meaningful results. So can you tell me what all these words mean and what the changes have taken place?
Thank you very much, Senator, for your question. The work that the Canadian Human Rights Commission has been doing over the last number of years is work that is really broad in scope, and it's detailed in our anti-racism action plan. And really that plan is a plan that is meant to address the Commission as a whole. Every single part of the Commission, every level of the Commission has a role to play in ensuring that we are the workplace that our employees deserve and the national human rights institution that Canadians can trust and rely on when they come with complaints.
Corrective action that you have taken. We have a limited amount of time. So can you tell me one, two, even just give me one even corrective action that has been taken?
So when we're speaking about individuals, we use the term corrective action because that is in reference to the way in which we handled misconduct in real time. And so while I'm not able to speak to the specifics of any individual personnel file, I would welcome the opportunity to speak to you about some of the meaningful work we've done across the organization to bring about change. And you asked a question around, what does that change really look like? How do we know? What have we done? So let me take the example of our complaints services branch. I think that is an area where we have heard this evening and in previous testimony considerable concerns about the way in which the Commission was examining and deciding race-based complaints. The Commission has undertaken over the last number of years a significant modernization initiative, which has involved the following steps amongst many. So first, there's been a training across the Complaint Services Division, and that training includes on trauma-informed approaches, uncovering unconscious bias, and a series of other forms of ongoing training that's been mandatory across the branch. The Complaints Services Division has also engaged by hiring Mark Hart, former Vice Chair of the Ontario Human Rights Tribunal, who himself had written a number of really important race-based decisions in that forum, to come and look at the tools we were using. And he gave a really frank account of what the Commission was doing and gave some really helpful guidance in terms of what the Commission should be doing differently. And that was concrete. It was changing, the review criteria that we're using when we're assessing files. It was also, developing a series of educational tools that are mandatory both for people who work within the Complaint Services branch and commissioners who review complaints. And we know that the work that's being done in complaints is seeing positive impacts because we've looked at the numbers and we've seen the number of dismissals go down, and more importantly, I would say we've seen the number of referrals go up to tribunal. So we've really seen, as I said, from 2018 at 6%, now up by 2022 to 18% of these complaints going forward. And we know that if we want to really affect meaningful change in this area, we need to have better data. And we've heard this from many stakeholders.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I will proceed to questions from senators, starting with the Deputy Chair, Senator Bernard, to be followed by Senator Jaffer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you for your testimony. Thank you all for being here. I guess I'll start with a very specific question. With regards to the development of the action plan, were any of the 9 Black employees who actually filed the grievance involved in the development of the action plan?
So as you may be aware, I joined the Commission a few months ago. And so while I've been learning a great deal about the work—
Your colleagues could answer that.
Absolutely. My understanding is yes, but I'm going to turn it over to Mr. Fine.
Thank you for the question, Senator. What I can tell you is that when an initial draft of our anti-racism action plan was prepared, It was disseminated amongst all of our employees, bargaining agents, stakeholders, and experts for input. So I cannot tell you right now who contributed, but I know many of our employees did contribute to it, and many of the bargaining agents contributed to it, and stakeholders and experts, and we incorporated, I believe, most of the comments that we received back.
My question was, were any of the 9 people involved? And part of maybe I could ask the question in another way. Were any of them invited to be involved in the development of actions to address the concerns that they had taken forward in a very meaningful way? Were any of them invited to be specifically involved?
So there were, in fact, specific invitations to all Black, racialized, Indigenous employees, including the signatories to the letter, when we held a facilitation with Arlene Huggins. And the idea of that facilitation was actually from the signatories of that letter. They had identified her in particular. And that facilitation was a confidential space in which those employees could share their experiences. And then Arlene Huggins could provide the commission with recommendations based on those concerns. And that's really one of the key parts of what then becomes the anti-racism action plan. So yes, there was an invitation to meet with Ms. Huggins, and yes, the commission accepted the recommendations Ms. Huggins made, and that formed part of the anti-racism action plan.
So you're saying they were actively involved in the creation of the action plan? That's what I'm trying to get at. Were they actively involved in the creation of the action plan?
So what I can say is they were certainly invited, those who were at the commission at the time. And I'm simply just not able to comment on exactly who participated in the confidential facilitation one way or the other, but certainly I can confirm that they were invited.
I think your colleagues perhaps had another response.
Thank you, Senator. I just wanted to add, within the letter from the 9 individuals, there was extensive action recommended. They went to the effort of articulating what they wanted and what they would recommend by way of change. And I can certainly attest that we were guided in large part by the information and the recommendations set forth in that letter. I joined in May of 2021. I'm not aware. I do know that many, if not all, racialized employees within the whole organization were written to individually to join the DAC, which is the Decolonization Anti-Racism Committee. There was a huge overture there. So the other thing I just wanted to add by way of context is at the time, it was a policy grievance brought in large part because of the letter, and there was confidentiality respected of those individuals given the fact there was an active policy grievance in place. So I don't know if that colored that. I would also like to add, of the 9 individuals, I don't know the exact numbers, but at least half. By the time I arrived at the commission, there was only 2 or 3. I'd have to get back to the committee with the exact number of individuals still with the commission at that time. Not sure if that's helpful.
One of the things that we've heard, and I'll ask this question specifically to Mr. Fine, one of the things we've heard is that one of the alleged perpetrators was actually in charge of developing the action plan. Could you comment on that, please?
The person who developed the action plan, Senator, was someone who was a longstanding member of our organization, who is very much committed to our anti-racism efforts. And so it is, for me, unthinkable that the individual who was in charge of that could have in any way done anything untoward. In fact, she is someone who is very committed to the work we're doing and very committed to anti-racism, and herself racialized.
Could I have one final question, Chair? Thank you. So I'd like to ask this question to all 3 of our witnesses. We have heard from many witnesses that not only is the culture at the Canadian Human Rights Commission toxic, a toxic work environment, but that the anti-Black racism runs rampant throughout the public service. And people in the public service would look to the Canadian Human Rights Commission to bring forward cases. And we've also heard that Black Canadians have lost all confidence in the Commission's ability to address complaints of anti-Black racism. And so we've heard your testimony. We appreciate you being here and giving this testimony. I've not heard anything in that testimony that speaks specifically to the climate, the workplace climate, the workplace culture, the systemic anti-Black racism that's really deep within the commission and public service. So on behalf of Canadians who are watching this, on behalf of Black Canadians who are paying attention to what we're doing here, what are you able to offer that would make them believe that things would be different?
Thank you very much for your question, Senator Bernard. And I do want to acknowledge that, you know, the commission has very much appreciated the testimony that you and others have given and the longstanding activism and advocacy that you've done in this space. And you know, I have to say, when I joined the Canadian Human Rights Commission, because I fundamentally believe in this organization's mission. I believe it is incredibly important that we uncover and eliminate racism and discrimination across this country. I believe systemic anti-Black racism is ingrained in all of our institutions, that the commission is not immune. And so certainly when I joined the commission, I was deeply troubled to hear some very, very negative experiences like those that have been shared with this committee. And what I will say, and I think this is very important, is that, you know, the organization, yes, has been doing a number of very concrete things to change the workplace. But this is only, you know, the beginning. We are committed to continuing to listen and learn and do what is necessary. And when we say that we are, you know, prepared to undergo a workplace evaluation, you know, that's certainly part of it. When we are going, you know, to the mediation table with the unions, that is also part of it, because I firmly believe in the potential of this organization. Since I've joined, I've had the opportunity to speak to employees across the organization, including Black and racialized employees, who have told me that their experiences, you know, for some of them have been very positive, that they call this organization, you know, a second family. And if it's possible for some people to have that experience, every single person who works at our organization deserves that same experience, deserves to come to work knowing that their full selves, they can bring their full selves to work, that they will be able to share their experiences, their expertise, be valued and respected.
Sorry to interrupt, but we're running out of time and I have a long list of senators. So we have Senator Jaffer to be followed by Senator Omidwar.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you for being here. I have other questions, but I'm going to go straight to what you were saying, that some have talked to you and they're very happy, but we would not be here. We would not be here if it wasn't that many are unhappy. And, you know, honestly, all my life, I've looked at for the Canadian Human Rights Commission to be one place where any Canadian can go, or, you know, within your mandate, and receive fair treatment. And obviously those that have suffered are not coming to talk to you. That's why we are sitting here today. And you know, my colleague has asked, the chair has asked, give us specific examples. And what I'm frustrated with is that you're just doing general, and I'm a lawyer, so I understand when you say issues of confidentiality, but there must be things that you can, that are not within the confines of the confidentiality, that you can tell us, because we are not going away hearing from you some specific things you've done.
Thank you very much for your question, Senator. And I want to be very clear. When I speak about people's positive experiences, that is an indication of the potential of this workplace. It is in no way diminish the incredibly difficult testimony that we have heard in this committee. And I have to say that it is very, very difficult for me to hear these experiences. I know that it is for my colleagues as well. And it is those very concerns that have animated the work we've done in the last number of years. And let me summarize that work.
Let me stop you and say, it's difficult for you to hear it. With all respect, what do you think for Ms. Betchi to come here publicly and to say this, and not even be able to work in a place where she really wants to work and has tried a number of times? How do you think she's reacting? And when you apologize, why did you not specifically apologize to her? And I don't want you to go behind, oh, it's legal, it's this. She's sitting here, you're apologizing. Why are you not apologizing to her directly?
I want to be very clear. I was deeply moved by Ms. Betchi's testimony today. The kinds of experiences that she is describing are not experiences that I can pretend to understand. I do not live in her skin, but to hear her as a new mom myself about these experiences in the workplace of a lifetime of intergenerational trauma, of having had the kinds of negative experiences she has described in our workplace, I'm dismayed to hear it. I'm heartbroken to hear it. It is absolutely categorically unacceptable. And I want to be very clear. In my opening remarks, I spoke about some instances in which, employees were treated with disrespect in the workplace. And I want to extend personally to Ms. Betchi that apology. It is unacceptable that you would have such experiences in our workplace.
Personally, you're apologizing.
I'm apologizing on behalf of the institution to Ms. Betchi personally.
The question I have is, I have so many, but I know the chair is going to stop me very soon. From your perspective, where do you think the main issue is? Is this the institutional or structural problem? Does it have to do more with the lack of oversight, or are there any larger sociological or cultural issues at play? Now, I know there are larger sociological. We'll leave that aside because that exists for racialized people, Black people, right across. But I'm just saying why, about 4, 5, or maybe 6, 7 years ago, Justice Department was in front of us with the same kind of things. They made some changes, and now understand from people who are working there, it's not so, the changes are not so effective as they were right at the beginning. But why are you here? Why are you here? If you're making the changes, why is Ms. Betchi here?
So I believe that the Canadian Human Rights Commission is on the right path, but I absolutely would never suggest that we've reached where we need to be. This is an ongoing process of taking concrete action at every level across the organization, reviewing our human resources policies, engaging in external experts to help us
So tell me,
review our...
what is it going to take? What is it going to take? Exactly what is it going to take? I know there's all kinds of policies, everything has to be examined. But if you wish, and I'm sure the government would give you assistance, you could change it. What will it take for you to be able to say that you made the changes?
Senator,
Sorry.
if I may respond to the question. I've thought hard about this. So the reason I think it's so hard to grapple with this is systemic racism. How do we, we would all love to dismantle systemic racism. And even the Treasury Board decision acknowledges these kinds of massive changes take time. That being said, as you say, we are not here. We wouldn't be here if it wasn't for 3 unions and 9 employees and the courage of Ms. Betchi to raise these issues to this level, and of the Senate to decide to dive into something like this. So clearly it's an issue, and it's something that needs to be addressed. So in terms of, as someone who's come to the commission within the last 2 years, things that I can point to, I think number one, representation of diversity at all levels, top down. That is critical. As soon as you have more voices, as soon as you have lived experiences, I think that's a fundamental thing that we can point to that's really improved. I know we have
Why
huge
isn't there
representation.
somebody sitting here from a racialized or Black person with you? Are they not in executive position?
Ms. Jaffer, if I may, I'm an Indigenous person. I'm a member of the
I
Métis
realize
Nation of
that.
Alberta. Oh, I'm
No,
so,
that's
my
okay.
apologies.
But I realize you are Indigenous person, but I'm saying this is an issue for Black. So
Absolutely.
why isn't there a Black person on the executive sitting here? I do respect, and I very much respect you, but I'm just saying, why isn't there, if they are in the executive position? Why are they not here with you, speaking with you?
I think it's very important to us that we not tokenize those individuals who are on our executive, who are Black, because, as leaders of this organization, we have accountability. We need to answer the questions that Canadians have, and we're not going to shirk those responsibilities. We know that the diversity we have is not
One
enough.
last question, Chair. Have you asked them whether they would come with you?
So we do have some senior Black executives who offered to come with us today.
But they're not here.
Who
It's
offered?
evident they are not here. Thank you, Chair.
So does that mean you chose not to ask them, or they chose not to come? You chose not to ask them to come?
We believed that it was important that the
I
most
want a
senior.
yes or no answer. You chose not to ask them to come?
We chose not to put that on the shoulders of the Black
So no.
executives we have.
So
We
the
did make
answer is
that
no.
choice.
Thank you very much. I'll attend. Oh, Senator Bernard has a supplemental, since followed by Senator Omidwar.
I didn't get an answer to my question. And it's along the same line as Senator Jaffer. I really want to know what will restore faith. That's what people want to hear. What will restore faith? And I haven't heard anything you've said up to now that gives me that critical hope that Ms. Betchi was talking about.
This is exactly the question that keeps me up at night. I believe we're on the right path, but what is it? What specific thing can we do that will restore confidence? Now, I'm hopeful that some of the things we've committed to doing are going to do just that. I'm hopeful that an independent workplace assessment like the unions have called for will bring some accountability and will bring some answers that people are looking for right now. I also hope that as we get, we improve our ability to collect data about exactly who's coming to the commission and what the outcomes are. We will better be able to answer people's questions about how race complaints are being dealt with. We know right now that we have been making significant improvements, that they are being referred onto tribunal at a much, much higher rate. We want to see that continue. And we want to ensure that when Canadians think of the Canadian Human Rights Commission, they think, I can go there and I can trust that my complaint's going to be dealt with fairly and with dignity. And I think that's what Canadians need to believe and know, and we need to act and show that that is what they can trust when they come to the commission.
Senator Omidwar to be followed by Senator Annett.
Thank you, witnesses, for sharing your perspectives with us. Ms. Malashevsky, I'm having a hard time. You said that you want public service employees to feel that I can go there. Based on the testimony we have heard, which frankly left me appalled, that at this point, Black employees do not have any trust or confidence in the CHRC. And in fact, some of the witnesses have called for it to be demolished. You've talked about, the regret you feel. You say you apologize on behalf of the commission. You fully accept the findings of the Treasury Board. But I want to ask you about not the victims, but about those who victimize. They are in your midst. They are in your midst. And I want to know, what consequences have they experienced as a result of this finding of individual and systemic discrimination? Are they still in your employment? Have they left? Have they been shuffled sideways? What accountability measures have you taken? And please don't hide again behind the legal confidentiality here. At least tell me what process has been put in place to hold them accountable.
Perhaps I could begin, and thank you for that question, Senator. I want to assure you, and I want to assure the Senate, all senators, that when we determined that there was misconduct in our organization, we dealt with it, and we dealt with it immediately when it happened. And I can assure you that everyone was held accountable for any misconduct that happened in our organization. We did not wait. We took it very seriously.
Okay. What range of actions? Demotion, a note in their personnel files, a sideways shuffle, dismissal? What range of actions? I know you can't talk about individual cases. I appreciate that, but give me a sense of the range of tools that you deployed.
So if I may, I think some of these are exactly the questions I had when I came into this role to try to understand, because we know this is systemic, but we also know that specific individuals engaged in misconduct. And so what I can say is that I take some comfort in knowing that none of those individuals are currently managing people at the commission. And that is very significant and important for us, because if we are going to have a workplace that is safe for all, it is very important that people be able to go to their managers and trust that they will be heard and respected. And so for us, that is a form of accountability that is very important and I think needs to be highlighted.
So if they were managing people before and they're not managing people now, can we make a conclusion that they've either been demoted or sideways shuffled?
I think it would be fair to say they are no longer in the same positions they were before.
Do I have time for a quick one? So I've heard you talk a lot about a whole of institution approach, embracing the whole organization. We've heard a lot about your plans, your processes, your policies, consultation. But frankly, in my opinion, process is used often by not just your institution, but by others to obfuscate progress, real progress. So on a scale of 1 to 10, where do you put yourself?
I think that's a very hard question. The Treasury Board decision certainly is a difficult one. The testimony we've heard, I don't know that we can put ourselves, give ourselves a good mark at this point. I certainly wouldn't be doing that. But what I think is very important is that when you say, procedures and policies can obfuscate progress, what is very important for us is that we have consistency across the organization from a top level down, that this is being not just messaged, but that there are concrete measures where we are looking to identify where do the barriers exist for our Black and racialized employees, what is actually happening in their experiences in the workplace, and how can we support them, whether that's through training or, acting opportunities. Those are very concrete things. They may seem like, human resources policies, and they may seem somewhat abstract, but those are the things that provide our employees with the support they need, the career advancement opportunities they need. And it's the way that we address this as a systemic problem, because we know that this goes far beyond, particular individual bad behavior. We know that systemic anti-racism is ingrained in our institutions. And so we need to look at the very foundation of those institutions to bring about the change that is required so that this Human Rights Commission lives up to the potential that it has, that it's the workplace that employees deserve and Canadians expect of us.
Thank you. Second round.
Senator Arnett, to be followed by Senator Gerben.
Well, thank you, witnesses, for coming today. And I know that you have a significant challenge to your reputation, and the Canadian Human Rights Commission is always recognized as speaking on human rights issues internationally, nationally. And I think it's fair to say you have a big impact on the provincial and territorial human rights commissions in this country. That challenge is huge, given what we've seen. I'm hoping that you can be a positive example, an exemplar to the rest of the civil service. As we know, there is a deep-seated anti-Black racism in Canadian society, and that's what's at the core of this issue. You've talked about the change. You've acknowledged that change is required, and in order for change to happen, it has to be measured, or else it won't happen. So I know you have a plan that you've implemented, but I'd be interested to know about how goals are set in that plan and how you're measured for accountability and transparency in the plan that you have. And then lastly, I'd like to hear about your confidence in actually creating a positive trust relationship between Canadians and the Canadian Human Rights Commission, especially Black Canadians.
Thank you very much, Senator Arnott, for the question. And I think it is absolutely fundamental that we address these issues because of the trust that is required, the public confidence that is required for the Commission to carry out its mandate. And so that's why accountability is fundamental in this anti-racism work. And let me tell you a bit about what that accountability looks like. So we have for sure built into performance agreements at the executive level, and we're working on ensuring it's across the organization for every employee, that they be assessed based on their contributions to anti-racism work, that this is actually a fundamental part of their work and that they are held accountable for it across the organization. So that's one piece. I think also an important piece of the accountability is recognizing that the commitments we've made at one point in time may need to evolve, may need to change, may need to be added to. And so we are engaged on an ongoing basis with an independent anti-racism change expert, Charles Smith, who meets with our senior leadership on a monthly basis and has exactly these hard conversations. You know, in the last few months I've been in the organization, we've gone branch by branch. We've looked at each branch and we've seen what are the anti-racism commitments in that branch. What is the progress we are making on those? We've been asking ourselves the difficult question when the progress hasn't been, what we had hoped. What do we need to do differently? And he has helped us, hold ourselves accountable and ensure by providing us feedback on those conversations that, from the highest levels in the organization all the way through, we are reflecting on an ongoing basis on the commitments we've made and thinking about what those commitments need to be going forward and what changes need to be put in place. I think it's also important to recognize that we are in a situation in which we are expecting to mediate with the unions and certainly, whether in that forum or through our network for advancing racial equality or internally with our decolonization and anti-racism consultation committee, we are very open to hearing about what more needs to be done to move the dial on this and to as possible. This is a problem ingrained in our society, ingrained in our institutions that is having such a traumatic impact on people, as we have heard. And so time is of the essence. We need to continue this work on an ongoing basis. And those are some of the forms of accountability that we have in place to ensure that that is exactly what we are doing.
I will now turn to Senator Gerber to be followed by Senator Pate.
Merci.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Chair. I'm going to speak French, and my question is for Ms. Malashewski. I am happy to see that you are recognizing the problem of racism, and I am also pleased to see that you have taken steps to ensure that this problem is addressed at the source. And as my colleague already asked, with regard to the Black community, what is your approach? And we can see that there must be more awareness at the Commission. And the problem is that complaints are often systematically rejected, and those that are approved take a great deal of time to deal with. And I've heard nothing that would convince me that there is an awareness and that there will be more complaints heard and approved for review. And do you not think that employees might be afraid of making a complaint? And what do you think about the delays in dealing with these complaints? That's a problem, sometimes 2-3 years. And we have cases here in the room. To the time taken to deal with these complaints. And can you reassure me that the institution is aware of this problem? Thank you very much for the question. And really, I think that the public's knowledge about the Commission is very important. It's essential that when people come to the Commission with a complaint, they must have the assurance that they will be dealt with fairly. And we're working very hard to ensure that that is what happens. And we'll continue to promote this kind of change. And you asked about delays in dealing with complaints. And I will ask in English, in French.
Has been raised here, and is something that we're really grappling with at the commission, is around the importance that we be accepting race-based complaints, that we be dealing with them, and that we be referring them on to tribunal, whenever there is that subtle scent of racism. That's what the case law tells us. And so, we have seen improvements in terms of the number of cases that are being referred on to tribunal. That significant increase in the last 5 years is a trend we want to make sure continues. But I think in looking at the way in which we deal with complaints and timelines, we are, quite frankly, having to juggle some quite difficult, different pieces. So, on the one hand, absolutely, timeliness is key. Delayed justice is no justice for many people. And so, at the moment, our average from first contact to the commission to closing of the file is 2 years. That's a really long time. We get that. It's better than it may have been, but it's still a long time. So that's on one hand. On the other hand, you've got the necessity to really deal with these complaints in a fulsome way to ensure that when our human rights officers are assessing these files, they are really looking for the evidence, and that they are assisting complaints throughout, that there is an opportunity, for our equal access unit within the complaint services to help support people through, that we take time for mediation, that we're really engaging meaningfully with the complaints. And that's a bit of a balancing act between, going through quickly versus going through in a really meaningful way. And I know in the organization's history, there have been times when the commission has put timeliness above all else. And in those times, there have been much more significant dismissal rates across all forms of complaints. We're seeing a trend away from that because we've specifically decided that it is important for us that we be dealing with complaints wherever we have the jurisdiction to deal with them, and that we be taking a really informed look at what it means when complainants come to the commission, what they might be alleging. Can we look behind? Can we find all the evidence to ensure that we're identifying systemic issues, and that we are referring on to tribunal when cases require further inquiry, and that we're able to find mediated solutions when that's possible as well.
And what about the long-term dealing with complaints? I mean, sometimes it takes more than 2 or 3 months to send a complaint on to the tribunal. Yes, of course.
Do we have some objectives, some standards around the handling of complaints? And I'd be happy to provide this committee afterwards with exactly what our service standards are. And they do go to specific parts of the complaints process, so how long we're dealing with them at each stage. I think it is really important to recognize when we're talking about a 2-year period, it's not as though there's someone working on it for that whole entire time. Actually, one of the biggest problems we have is that at any given time, about 25% of our inventory is actually assigned to a human rights officer, because that's the capacity we have. So we are working within, the system that we have to be as efficient as we can, to modernize our processes so that we can move these files forward more quickly. But certainly, there are different places where complaints are sort of waiting, and one of them is, quite frankly, waiting to be assigned to a human rights officer for assessment.
While they are waiting, what do you do for the employees, those that have filed a complaint? And earlier we heard that the previous witness had a premature birth because of the tension of waiting. When I hear these kinds of experiences, I really can't imagine what it's like, and I find it so difficult. I can't describe my reaction. And it's certain that many of the people who come to the commission have lived experiences that have been very difficult and that continue to be in a difficult situation while waiting for their complaint to be dealt with. And certainly we must provide support for such people in the commission under the law. There could be other supports provided to individuals while they're waiting for a complaint to be heard. And I think it was something we could do.
Pete? Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and thank you to the witnesses. A couple of things first that I want to ask you to comment on at the end, but I was struck when Ms. Betchi spoke about the comment that people want to be treated as human, to be seen as human. All of my working life has been spent working with individuals who, for various reasons, have made that plea, whether it's because of discrimination on the basis of race, sex or gender, ability, class, circumstance. And it strikes me that we need to see leadership within the government writ large, that we look to the Human Rights Commission to be an exemplar, if you will. And so I have three questions. One, can we receive, if we have not already, and I apologize, I'm substituting for someone. If we don't already have a copy of the action plan, could we receive a copy of the action plan and some of the measures that you've spoken about? Secondly, what are the recommendations that you feel would be helpful to the Commission to move forward on the types of commitments that you're talking about and that my colleagues have asked you about? And third, where are you seeing leadership on this that provides the movement forward within the government writ large? Because I was also struck by Ms. Betchi's comment about most things being performative, and in my humble opinion, most of what we've seen this government put forward with respect to substantive equality or the priority interests of those who are intentionally ignored and I think of the Section 15 protections that should be in place for folks in this country that aren't, that very rarely do we see true action that is beyond performative. So where are the substantive portions of these sorts of actions coming from? Where's the leadership coming? Where's the support coming for you to make those changes within your, obviously you've talked about within your commission, but also outside of the commission?
So thank you very much for the question. Certainly, human rights law is meant to recognize the full dignity of people's lived experiences. That's what I know brings me and I think many of my colleagues to do this work. And so I absolutely share in the belief that that ought to animate, who we are as an employer and also as a service provider. We do have an accountability framework within our complaint screening, which is about ensuring equity, transparency, consistency, and impartiality, so that everyone who participates in the system can do so, with ensuring that it is a fair process, but also with dignity. And that's really important for us. And some of the ways we ensure that that's happening is by avoiding situations where sort of any one specific individual would have the ability to influence the outcome of a case. It's having checks and balances across the system. So I would add that in terms of the ways in which we can better ensure accountability ourselves within the organization. In terms of the Anti-Racism Action Plan, absolutely would be very pleased to provide you a copy, as well as all of the members of this committee. I would also encourage you to take a look at the progress reports. We are committed to publishing publicly our progress on our Anti-Racism Action Plan. We've done that twice already, and we'll be continuing to do that. So we will certainly provide that for you. In terms of recommendations with respect to the Canadian Human Rights Act, so, it's
as you can appreciate, the Canadian Human Rights Act is certainly an older piece of legislation. We just celebrated the 45 years of that piece of legislation, and it hasn't been comprehensively reviewed since then. There's been tweaks for sure, and so certainly the commission is in favor of a review that would look at the gaps in protection that's afforded by the Canadian Human Rights Act. And some of those, include around the limited nature of financial compensation that's available. So that's upping the damages cap. It's also around, the difficulty of access of the system. It's, as we've heard from some witnesses, quite, it's time consuming, but it's also costly. Most of the people who come forward with discrimination complaints, they don't have a lawyer. And one of the reasons for that, and we've heard it certainly from lawyers that say it's just not worth my while to support someone through this because there's no cost regime. So you may be successful in the end, but that's a limitation for sure. Some of the other areas also include around, there's quite limited protection for retaliation offered to complainants after a complaint is filed. So that's an area which we see as a gap. And certainly, there is currently a requirement for a legal presence in Canada as a prerequisite for filing a complaint. And we see that as a significant barrier. We believe that human rights justice ought to apply to every person in Canada, and that, that can exclude some folks who, for immigration and other reasons, are excluded by that provision. So those are some of the ways in which we would see changes being made. But certainly, we would welcome any changes to the Canadian Human Rights Act and other pieces of legislation that would advance human rights justice in its full meaning. And we certainly heard some interesting ideas around that we would welcome, such as a Black Equity Commissioner and other kinds of ideas like that as well.
And in terms of where you're seeing leadership or support for the actions you're trying to take?
So we've been seeing the support, I would say, within the community. That's where we have been really relying on our stakeholders and rights holders to hold us to account, to tell us what the needs are from their perspective, and to challenge us when we're not living up to it. So I think that's where I've really seen significant leadership. It's in the communities, and that's not surprising. We see certainly the most meaningful advancements in Canadian history have been from advocates. And so as the Canadian Human Rights Institution, we are we're an institution that is created by legislation. That can seem a little that we are we're a governmental institution in that sense, but we are very much informed and connected to communities of people with lived experience. And I think that's really where we're seeing the leadership and where we're finding accountability as well.
So last week we heard from witnesses that training is not sufficient to put an end to racism in the workplace and that remedies are needed. Mr. Coward said that, and he said this last week, that training is not enough and unconscious bias is often used as an excuse. So I would like to ask you, what remedies have been offered to survivors of racism within the CHRC?
Thank you very much for the question, Senator. The question around training is one that we've certainly grappled with because we know that education is really important, but we also want to ensure that the training that we are offering is actually meaningful. And so certainly unconscious bias training is one part of it, but it's just one part of the training we've been doing. We've also had training around trauma-informed approaches, training around how to have conversations about racism that don't perpetuate hate. There's a number of forms of training that we have been undertaking to ensure that really there is support for everyone who's working at the commission to do the work they are doing and to be informed and educated in doing so. In terms of the experience of Mr. Coward, and I really do want to take a moment here because I heard of his experiences certainly before this committee's study, but I also listened to his testimony, and it is unthinkable that anyone would be serving this country and face such
overt racism, and then for that person to come before the Canadian Human Rights Commission with a complaint and not find a remedy here is frankly a disgrace and certainly a failure. I'd like to believe that since that complaint was filed in 1993, the law has evolved, society has evolved, and the commission has evolved, but we know that we continue to have work to do. And with respect to the accountability piece here, I think the most important initiative, though there are many, is around our disaggregated data collection. And that is so that we can ensure that we are tracking who is coming to the commission with a complaint beyond the 13 grounds in the Canadian Human Rights Act, because we know that that groups people with quite different experiences together. For example, unless someone self-identifies as Black, we don't necessarily know that from the grounds in the Canadian Human Rights Act. So getting the data on, how people self-identify and then tracking in a disaggregated way exactly what their outcomes are so that we know exactly how the complaints are being dealt with. We can identify if there are problematic trends, and we can ensure we're on track to be dealing with all complaints in a fair manner, and to ensure that complaints are being dealt with and referred to tribunal as they should.
Remedies offered to survivors? Has anything been offered to the survivors of racism?
So in terms of our complaints function under the Canadian Human Rights Act, there are certainly there's the possibility of damages as a result of a human rights complaint. I'm not sure if that's what you're referring to. That is an area where the Commission has advocated. We do believe that those caps are quite low, given the nature and significance of the trauma that many people have experienced when they come with discrimination complaints.
Two brief questions. Is the CHRC better positioned than the tribunal to screen complaints in a fair and impartial manner? Please explain. And also, how does the length of the federal process compare to the direct access model in British Columbia and Ontario?
Thank you very much for the question. I don't have in front of me the numbers for the provincial model, but I would be happy to look into that and provide you answers. It certainly is the Commission's view that one of the things that would be very important if Parliament is looking at direct access at the federal level is to look at exactly what the experiences have been in the provinces that do have it, in Ontario and BC, so that whatever changes are made don't create more problems, than they solve. When we talk about the complaints screening function at the federal level, I think it's important to recognize sort of what that actually entails. And it's a series of quite meaningful ways in which the Commission accompanies people through the complaints process. So that is, from intake, assisting people in articulating their complaint on the basis of the requirements of the Act. It's ensuring there are supports for complainants as they're moving through the system. And while there are certain supports, identified, certainly, we also have an equal access unit that is designed to step in where there is more support required, and that is actively working to ensure that we have the supports in place to ensure that people are going through our system with dignity. There's also the opportunity for mediation, and we've seen that's really a meaningful way in many cases to get justice more quickly and to get something meaningful. And certainly, depending on the year, our settlement figures are anywhere between 60 and 70%. And we have looked at it, and we have ensured that settlements are happening for race-based complaints at comparable levels as they are for other complaints. That was one of the things that we wanted to ensure was the case. So mediation is one of the things. And then, as we move forward and complaints do go on to the tribunal, the Commission actually can participate. And that means, showing up, our lawyers showing up, making arguments, hiring experts.
Sorry to interrupt, but I think I've got Senator Umidwar. No. So I have two senators and we have 5 minutes left. So senators, if you can be really brief, Senator Bernard, and then followed by Senator Jaffer.
Thank you, Chair. I just have one follow-up question, actually. In your response to, I think it was Senator Pate's question around changes to the act, it was raised earlier by Senator Omidvar that there's nothing in the act that speaks to commissioners being from some of the, I'll use the term equity deserving groups, not equity seeking groups. I do that deliberately. And so in talking about changes that you think would be helpful to the act, you've identified a number, so I appreciate that. What are your thoughts about the changes around who the commissioners should be?
Thank you very much for the question. And certainly, I take your correction well. They are indeed equity deserving groups. If it were, of interest to Parliament to do something like that, that's certainly something that would be of interest to the Commission. Really, what we think is important is that there be diversity at every level of the organization. And as you can appreciate, commissioners are appointed by government. And so ultimately, the diversity that exists at that level is a result of government decisions. And certainly, if there were to be parameters to ensure representation at that level, that would be one of the ways to ensure accountability and to make sure that there is that representation on an ongoing basis.
I have one last question that I'd like a yes or no from each of you, please. We've heard from several witnesses that the commission needs a total overhaul. What do you say to that, yes or no?
I guess starting with Mr. Fine and then we can just go.
Thank you for your question, Senator. We have been trying our very best over the past many years to address concerns raised by our employees and by Canadians.
Yes or no? Is there a need for a total overhaul? And this links back to the question I was asking earlier. In terms of restoring the faith of Black Canadians, many feel that anything short of a total overhaul will not restore their faith. And so just a yes or no?
No.
No, okay.
I similarly believe that we can do this work saving we can change the organization from within, that there are necessary changes to legislation, absolutely, but a total overhaul is not required in this particular instance. We can bring about what is needed in other ways.
You're a no, okay.
So a no, I think it can be changed from within.
Thank you very much. Senator Jaffe.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chair. You brought up the issue of unrepresented number of times. Well, that's the reality of all across the country, even in appeal courts. I'm sure you know that. And of course, it's based on costs, and your structure doesn't give costs. So that's just for people who are listening, that's a challenge. But Chair, I suggest that the panel be given the transcript, and there are many questions that have not been answered. And also, you have also offered to send documents. Yeah. So let's have a look at that and then call them back, because obviously there are lots of gaps. I have to tell you, my frustration is that, in the Senate, we have the privilege of asking you questions, right? And expect an answer. People that work with you don't have that privilege. People who appear in front of you don't have that privilege. And so I feel that we need those answers from you. And so, Chair, may I ask for steering to consider bringing this panel back?
Thank you, Senator Jaffe. We'll bring this issue up at this steering. So I want to sincerely thank our witnesses for agreeing to participate in this important study, and your assistance with the study is greatly appreciated. Senators, we'll suspend very briefly to get ready for the next panel.
An internal review has found that Canada's human rights watchdog discriminated against its own employees. Well, tonight, some of them are speaking exclusively to David Thurton about the racism they experienced.
I had never had the privilege.
Bernadeth Betchi wants the public to know about the hurt she and other Black civil servants endured.
Sadness, anger, exhaustion. Having to prove that Black bodies are worthy of human is exhausting.
Betchi worked at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the arm's-length federal body that's supposed to investigate discrimination.
I would describe the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the environment, the workplace, as toxic, poisonous. It has affected my mental and physical well-being and health, and I'm not the only one.
Betchi and 8 others filed a complaint alleging discriminatory practices, including that race-based complaints were often dismissed by all white investigative teams, that when she and her colleagues spoke up, colleagues demeaned them, and that Black employees were excluded in career advancement. The federal government's human resource arm agreed the commission did discriminate against its own workers.
If the commission itself is guilty of discriminatory practices, really what chance do Canadians have to rely on the commission to protect them from discriminatory practices?
I don't recommend anyone that is Black, racialized, or again, from any religious minority group to file a complaint at the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
That's why Betchi wants a third-party investigation by someone experienced in anti-Black racism.
They need to come and investigate anti-Black racism within the commission.
In a statement, the commission says it accepts the findings. It says it's committed to anti-racism, but won't comment further because the matter is before mediation. Justice Minister David Lametti says the findings are disappointing and concerning. David Thurton, CBC News, Ottawa.
We have a breaking story to tell you about this hour. CBC News has learned that Black members of the civil service, the Canadian Public Service, both current and former members, have launched a lawsuit against the government, alleging decades of discrimination that kept them from advancing in their careers.
The suit aims to represent tens of thousands of employees alleging decades of anti-Black discrimination.
The class action lawsuit alleges systemic discrimination toward Black public employees, specifically that they faced discrimination in the hiring process and when up for promotions dating back to the 1970s.
Make no mistake, this is a major development, a significant, a landmark case, $900 million that has implications for organizations and institutions across the country.
I've been talking to various women. They all know Harriet Tubman. They want to know about the weight that we carry in public. There was a time when a wife couldn't marry her husband. There was a time she couldn't share that she loved him. Some parents are from this, still carrying grudges. And they say, okay, just get over it, it's done. But to understand the why, you gotta know where it's from. Look, I got white friends, even they don't understand why one black man would hate one that's light-skinned. It's crazy, cause the brothers where they come from, like, how could someone hate just based upon the color? I know, right? It's crazy when you say it on its own, right? I'm just saying, when you place it in its own light, like I'm saying, the concept alone, like, crazy. Look, I know this might not be you, and there's others, I just hope there might not be few. If you just listen and your vision just might not be skewed, and I might not be viewed as less.
We're liberated in love, but it starts with yourself. Go ahead and free yourself from the hate you're feeling. We're no longer the same. We're not separate but equal. We just wanna see change. We need a heart for the people.
Look, this goes out to all the various workers on the front line sharing your service. I know you carrying burdens, but I thank you for staying right there in your purpose. They don't care if you're serving, they treat you low, like right there with the vermin. I try and be careful with wording, I wanna make sure your narrative's heard, cause you deserve it. No matter what it looks like, I want it to look right further. And no matter what it looks like, it'll be better than all this hurting. Look, after we gather together and say that we rather not have it this way and we rather be happy today, I'm just saying that black workers matter, okay?
We're liberated in love, but it starts with yourself. Go ahead and free yourself from the hate you're feeling. We're no longer the same. We're not separate but equal. We just wanna see change. We need a heart for the people.
Look, when they say save the rainforest, do you see other trees and leaves like that ain't forest? What I'm saying is the same chorus can be sung for anyone in need of the same force. So spread love like you wanna be loved, you know the song, right? And if you don't, just stand there and nod like this. If we could do that, I think we'll be alright.
Us in person at the table, I wish to welcome from the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat, Carol Bedell, who's the Associate Assistant Deputy Minister, Employee Relations and Total Compensation, Office of the Chief Human Resources. And from Canadian Heritage, we have Gavin Cadot, Assistant Deputy Minister, Anti-Racism Strategy and Action Plan on Combating Hate, and Peter Feigl, Executive Director, Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat. I will now invite Ms. Cadot to make her presentation.
Madam Chair, honorable members of the committee, thank you for having me. My name is Gavin Cadot. I am the Assistant Deputy Minister at Canadian Heritage, responsible for the anti-racism strategy and the action plan for combating hate. I'm joined by my colleague, Peter Feigl, Executive Director of the Anti-Racism Secretariat. It is an honor for us to be here joining you today on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Naugatuck people. I would like to say at the outset that there is no place in Canada for anti-Black racism, and that hate or discrimination in any form is unacceptable and must be eradicated. Notre ministère travaille sans relâche pour soutenir les efforts.
Our department works tirelessly to support the efforts of the entire federal government to build an open, welcoming, and inclusive Canada in which no one faces systemic racism, racial discrimination, or is terrorized by hatred simply because they are Black, Indigenous, Asian, Muslim, or Jewish, and/or a member of any other equity population.
Acknowledged the serious problem of systemic anti-Black racism in public institutions. As such, Canada has acknowledged its responsibility to work directly with Black communities to combat systemic racism. Le ministère du Patrimoine canadien a été actif dans le...
The Department of Canadian Heritage has been active in the fight against anti-Black racism. Since 2018, it has committed $9 million to improve local community supports for Black Canadian youth, including empowering young people of African descent to address anti-Black racism. Since the launch of Canada's anti-racism strategy in 2019, Canadian Heritage has committed nearly $100 million to address systemic racism and discrimination, including anti-Black racism. This includes the creation of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat to lead a whole-of-government approach to addressing systemic racism, discrimination, and hatred in Canada.
On the ways in which federal policies, programs, services, and laws impact Canadian society at large, and more specifically, communities and peoples with lived experience of racism. It bears mentioning that in 2018, the Government of Canada officially recognized the International Decade for People of African Descent. The Department of Employment and Social Development Canada is leading work on leveraging the decade as a framework for the government to take concrete steps to secure the rights and freedoms of people of African descent from a whole of government perspective. The Treasury Board Secretariat is the leader across the federal public service in addressing harassment, equity, and inclusion within government workplaces. And my colleagues from the Treasury Board Secretariat will be able to answer any questions regarding measures that the government is taking to address anti-Black racism and discrimination in federal public service workplaces. At Patrimoine Canadien, nous avons consacré
At Canadian Heritage, we have dedicated more than $5 million since 2018 to fund a variety of projects that empower Black communities, including youth, to take action against anti-Black racism. These include the It Takes a Village project.
By the Day Learning Institute. It hosted various activities to help Black youths develop skills for the future and finding solutions to overcome their experiences of anti-Black racism. The Edmonton-based African Canadian Civic Engagement Council, in partnership with the Edmonton Police, led the project called Advanced Youth Academy Leadership to advance alternatives to the traditional criminal justice system using a restorative justice approach. The department is also providing $1.5 million towards an endowment to support the ongoing activities of the Jean-Augustine Chair in Education, Community, and Diaspora. La dernière chose que je dirais, c'est que nous préparons actuellement la nouvelle stratégie.
The last thing I would say is we are currently preparing Canada's new anti-racism strategy and anti-hate action plan to reflect the recommendations of hundreds of Black leaders across the country, including Black youth, and identify specific ways for the government to combat anti-Black racism. Both of these initiatives are top priorities for Minister Hussein.
That there is still hard work to be done. We know this because too often Black people everywhere in Canada face discrimination, intolerance, and hatred as a daily fact of life. And this is not the Canada we want. It's not the Canada that we know we can be. So once again, I thank you for inviting us, and we're happy to answer any questions that you may have. Merci.
Thank you. Ms. Bedell, do you have an opening statement? Yes.
I do. Thank you, Madam Chair. Merci, Madame la Présidente. Donc, avant de commencer, j'aimerais...
Before beginning, I would like to acknowledge that I am speaking to you on the traditional unceded territory of the Algonquin Anishinaabe people. I want to thank the committee for inviting me to speak here today. Chair, I am appearing today in response to an invitation by this committee. I hold the position of Assistant Deputy Minister of Employee Relations and Total Compensation within the Office of the Chief Human Resources Officer at the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat. While in this role, I have a number of responsibilities. I am here today to speak about my role as the delegated employer decision maker on policy grievances, and in particular, about policy grievances filed by 3 bargaining agents alleging discrimination at the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
Human Resources Officer is the Policy Center for Human Resources Management in the Federal Public Service. We develop broad policy direction and standards that enable deputy heads to fulfill their responsibilities for effective people management within their organization. The Federal Public Service Labor Relations Act refers to three types of grievances: individual grievances, group grievances, and policy grievances. Now, policy grievances provide the employer and the bargaining agent with the opportunity to raise a general dispute about the interpretation or application of a collective agreement as it relates to them or to the bargaining unit generally. The policy grievance process generally has one decision-making level internal to the employer. I am the delegated authority at that level for the Treasury Board Secretariat as employer. However, bargaining agents may choose to skip this level and refer the policy grievance directly to the Federal Public Sector Labor Relations and Employment Board for independent third-party adjudication. In October and November of 2020, 3 bargaining agents, the Public Service Alliance of Canada, the Association of Justice Council, and the Canadian Association of Professional Employees, submitted policy grievances to the Treasury Board Secretariat as employer. Each grievance alleged discrimination at the Canadian Human Rights Commission in violation of the relevant collective agreements. In my role as policy grievance decision maker, I reviewed written submissions from these bargaining agents and from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. I also met twice with the bargaining agent representatives, where they had an opportunity to make oral representations and respond to my questions relating to their submissions. On March 6, 2023, I issued my response. I determined, based on the information that was provided to me in the context of this grievance process, that the no discrimination clause of each of the 3 collective agreements had been breached. As part of my decision, I advised the parties that the Treasury Board Secretariat remained available at their request to support them as they continued to work towards achieving a discrimination-free workplace. The bargaining agents subsequently referred their grievances for an arbitration hearing at the Public Sector Labor Relations and Employment Board. And the board is now going to determine its process and the next steps for these cases. Le Secrétariat du Conseil du Trésor, de concert.
The Treasury Board Secretariat, along with all government departments, are actively working to address issues arising from discrimination and to create a diverse and inclusive public service. The government is working to eliminate racism and discrimination from our institutions, including passing legislation, creating support and development programs, and publishing disaggregated data. Some of the specific actions are cultural elements and ensuring that employees from these groups have access to an obstacle-free process to ensure the defense of their rights. As part of our leadership, we have a program for training for level 1 employees, which allows employees to participate in management and as well as ensuring leadership in the public service for tomorrow. In addition, the 2023 budget announced that the Treasury Board Secretariat will develop, through consultations using an expert panel, a restorative engagement process across the public service where employees who have suffered harassment and discrimination can share their personal accounts in a safe, confidential space to contribute to systemic change.
Any of the questions that you may have as well today.
Thank you. I will turn to the senators for the questions and answers, 5 minutes, and I will start with Senator Omidwar.
Thank you, Chair, very much for accommodating my schedule, and thank you so much to our witnesses for your perspectives. My questions are all for Ms. Bedell from the Treasury Board Secretariat, and maybe I can put 2 of them together because they're related, and a second one. The first is about recommendations that we heard last week from witnesses calling for amendments to the Employment Equity Act, including explicitly adding Black people as a designated group, separate from and distinct from members of a visible minority group. What are the advantages and disadvantages of adding more specific designated groups to the Employment Equity Act?
The Employment Equity Act doesn't fall under the ambit of my responsibilities at Treasury Board and under Treasury Board generally. However, what I can tell you is that in the context of self-identification, adding new opportunities for members of equity-seeking communities to be able to self-identify was seen as a positive advancement.
Thank you. And let's use the language of Senator Bernard, equity deserving versus equity seeking group. My second question is on representation of equity deserving groups, in this instance, the Black community, on the commission's appointed commissioners. There are 6 commissioners. We all know that. How does the federal government ensure that there is representation at this level?
Unfortunately, I'm not privy to the manner in which commissioners of the Canadian Human Rights Commission are
The governor
appointed.
and council decision. Yeah, okay. My third question, and this I'm going to read because it's complicated and it's long. Last week, we heard from Hugh Scher, a human rights and constitutional lawyer, who argued that the recent finding of discrimination against the CHRC by the Treasury Board of Canada Secretariat could be intended to harm the prospects of a proposed class action lawsuit brought by Black federal public servants alleging racial discrimination in the federal public service, stating that it is an unfair and bad faith use of the grievance process. How would you respond to these comments?
Thank you for the question. In accordance with the legislative and bargaining policy grievance process, my role as a decision maker is to look at collective agreements, weigh all the information and the submissions that are provided to me, and raise a conclusion or reach a conclusion where a collective agreement has been breached. That is what I did in these cases. And I can assure you that the Treasury Board Secretariat remains committed to ensuring access to a robust and effective and fair grievance process that addresses issues as they arise.
So in other words, you refute the witness testimony we heard last week.
What I'm stating is that the decision that I made was based on the facts that were presented before me.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Thank you. Senator Bernard, to be followed by Senator Arnett.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you all for being here this evening. And we apologize that we've gone longer. And I think the fact that we've taken more time with each of the panels really speaks to the heaviness of the issues we're addressing. So thank you for your patience. I think I'll start with the question following up from Senator Omarfar's question around with the Treasury Board. Could I ask you to comment on the government's response to your ruling? What are your reflections on the government's response to your ruling?
To the government, I'm sorry, can you repeat the question?
What are your reflections on the government's response to your ruling? And I'll add to that, what are your reflections on the community's response to your ruling?
Thank you. I think that I understand from media reports that have been communicated to me that the Canadian Human Rights Commission did accept the findings from my decision. And I understand as well that there have been comments from other ministers with respect to the situation that was raised as a result of the grievances in my decision. And at this point, I'm not going to be able to comment any further on their response, as the matter, as you know, is still before the Public Service Labor Relations Board.
Thank you. Let me ask the Canadian Heritage Secretariat. Could you tell us how issues of anti-Black racism are specifically taken up within the anti-racism strategy? So I know when the strategy was being developed, there was strong community pressure from different parts of the country to do something specifically about anti-Black racism. So how are issues of anti-Black racism specifically addressed in the Secretariat?
Thank you for the question, Senator, and perhaps I can start and my colleague Peter will continue on. You're absolutely right, and through the work of the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat, we actually conducted a national summit on anti-Black racism, and this was hundreds of youth, included hundreds of youth and Black leaders, and all of this work is helping us to inform a renewed strategy. As part of the first strategy, there were initiatives to support Black communities and specific funding programs. $5 million was provided to communities to support specific initiatives for anti-Black racism. And so this is definitely a big part of the work that we want to do, but going forward, recognizing that there needs to be specific focus on anti-Black racism. I'll let Peter elaborate as well.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senators. So the first thing I'd say is that when the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat was set up, it was very important for us to take a distinction-based approach to racism. So recognizing that racism is a systemic whole-of-government problem, but which cannot be solved by a cookie-cutter or all-size-fits-all approach. And so that's why, as soon as it was set up, we took the time to sit down with Black community leaders, hundreds of Black community leaders from across the country, representing a variety of different communities and intersections, to first understand what are some of the challenges that they're being faced? What are some of the systemic barriers that currently and consistently continue to affect the communities? What are some of the gaps in the federal policies, programs, services, and legislations that are out there? And then lastly, and perhaps most importantly, what are the new policies, programs, services, and legislations that are required to address the systemic and endemic problem of anti-Black racism in Canada? And so part of that, we also sat down with hundreds of Black youth and sat them down in front of cabinet ministers so that they could tell the cabinet ministers, this is what we need for our communities. This is what we need to make our lives better. This is what we need to remove systemic anti-Black racism. And there were two, among many, recommendations that stood out. One was that the federal government needed to investigate the reality of anti-Black racism within the youth criminal justice system. And two, that the government of Canada needed to set up Canada's Black justice strategy. So as soon as we heard that, we went directly to the Department of Justice and said, this is what we're hearing from Black youth. And we were able to work with the Department of Justice to conduct a study, which was community-led, community-driven, on the experiences of Black youth with the criminal justice system, which created a whole slew of recommendations. And as you know, the other recommendations, which was setting up Canada's Black justice strategy, was announced by the government, and we're working hand in hand with the Department of Justice as well as with Black community organizations across the country to advance that strategy forward. So that's just a few examples of the ways in which, number one, we take anti-Black racism very seriously, and we're working with community and our colleagues across government to affect change.
Thank you for that. Do I have one more question? Or do you want to put me on a second round? Okay, no second round with your panel. Aren't you lucky? I want to pick up on a question that I asked earlier, and that was around the whole issue of an apology and the resistance to an apology. So many Black youth are part of the Nova Scotia DPAT, and they have twice now had a national petition asking for an apology. Both times petitions were tabled in the House, and we've not had an apology. So what are your thoughts about that? And how does that impact the work that you're doing?
Well, I guess I'll start on that one. We are aware of those two petitions that have been put in front of the House, and we recognize that to move forward, that recognition of systemic racism and the harms of slavery in Canada and the harms of the discrimination that Black people live with in Canada is really a serious problem that needs to be addressed by all of government at various levels. I can only say that this is something that we're aware of, and I know that there is consideration. I think my colleagues, as I mentioned in my opening remarks at Employment Social Development Canada, are leading work on the decade and building a framework around the decade for people of African descent. And so I believe
was one of the recommendations.
yeah, and so as I mentioned, that's something that we're aware of as one of the recommendations, and hear the calls that are being made. So I'm sure this is all being used to inform steps going forward. Thank you.
Thank you.
Senator Arnett to be followed by Senator Gerber.
Thank you, and thank you, witnesses. I just wanted to make mention of a point here, and that is, I believe Nicholas Thompson from the Black Class Action Secretariat Panel 3 last week mentioned publicly recently, and it's something I think we should follow up, is that the Federal Anti-Racism Secretariat should be moved from Heritage Canada to the Privy Council office to report directly to the clerk of the Privy Council. And so I'd like that person to be invited to amplify that. So I'm guessing as to why he said that, but I'm asking the question, would you agree with that? Because you have a whole of government approach and a whole of government solution, but would it not be a stronger base given the structure of government and the ability to have mandatory compliance and given a highest priority possible based on the strongest foundation and perhaps robust funding to go with that, to ensure that the programming that you're doing, in fact, has the backing of a whole of government approach, not from just the Ministry of Heritage, but from the the clerk of the Privy Council, to make it, a significant priority to address anti-Black racism. I ask you for your opinion on that, all three witnesses.
Perhaps I'll start. So as you know, thank you for your question, Senator. As you know, decisions of machinery are not ours as public servants to take. But what I can say is that we have a very strong federal anti-racism secretariat with strong leadership, a diverse team across the country, a distributed team that work day in and day out tirelessly and with their full beings and hearts to work towards a whole of government approach to eradicating racism and anti-Black racism. The Secretariat is special in that it reports directly to our Associate Deputy Minister and also reports directly to me. And so there's a level there of freedom, if you will, to speak directly with decision makers. I believe that I agree with you that a strengthened and supported anti-racism secretariat is important. We have seen the results of their work to date and the difference that this secretariat is making. And that's part of the mandate letter commitment for our minister to continue to support and to strengthen the secretariat.
Are you aware of the concern or the criticism Mr. Thompson raised publicly? And if so, do you know why he's raising that?
Well, I'll start by saying, and I said this in my opening remarks, that Canadian Heritage is committed to addressing anti-Black racism, and we're proud, as I said, of the teams that we have doing this work. And we are aware of that message and the concerns that were raised about that individual. And all I can say is that the department takes all information regarding its mandate and its workforce very seriously, and we're reviewing the situation. But beyond that, cannot comment. Thank
Okay.
you.
I understand that it may not be appropriate for me to ask you that question, but Mr. Flagel or Ms. Bedell, any comments on that?
I can tell you that with respect to the clerk's call to action on anti-racism and equity and inclusion is being taken seriously, not only at Treasury Board Secretariat, but across all departments as well. And there are a number of key government-wide initiatives that are taking place, and horizontal consultation is taking place with stakeholders and across different departments as well. And that is happening now.
Thank you, Senator Annette. Senator Gerbert to be followed by Senator Page.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Chair. I'm very pleased that you were able to be with us today. And Ms. Cadot, we see that there's been a great deal of effort on the part of Heritage Canada to combat racism, anti-Black racism, and the government has invested a great amount of money to support organizations that are fighting discrimination, anti-Black racism, that are, and what progress has been made since you've been investing so much money, and how would you measure the results of these programs?
Merci. Yes.
Thank you very much, Senator, for your question. And it's true that we've undertaken a great deal of work to fight racism, and this is something that we want to continue to improve. We want to, for example, get more disaggregated data on progress made within the public service, and we also have an evaluation plan for our efforts, and we have performance indicators, but we do not have the information, the data for the government as a whole. And we want to try and improve that in the future in order to be able to better say what progress we have been able to make, and to show that we've succeeded, that these programs have been successful. I don't know if my colleague wishes to say something. Yes, thank you very much, Chair. If we look at 2018, the government invested about 25 million to support Black communities to deal with the problem of anti-Black racism and the persons of African descent. And we've also organized a number of consultations with the Black community to identify what is lacking and what we can do more to deal with this problem. And thanks to that, and thanks to the help of the Black community, we have funding programs for Black entrepreneurs, and we have the first fund for Black communities, $200 million. And these are things that show that there has been a great deal of investment since 2018, thanks to mobilization with the Black communities. Of course, there's a lot more to be done, and we have a very interesting and worthwhile framework in consultation with the Black communities to come to a point where Canada and where all Canadian Black communities will be able to take full advantage of their citizenship and rights. Thank you very much. With the testimony from the Human Rights Commission, we have seen that there are a number of delays. There are often delays in dealing with complaints, and processing complaints. Do you have a policy that might go beyond your own ministry to try and identify problems at the commission and to possibly exert some influence on the commission's process for dealing with complaints? And of course, we had a witness here in the room that said that it was so difficult to go through this long process of a complaint. And do you have anything or any way of influencing how these things are dealt with by the commission? Basically, I think I'll ask my colleague to answer. Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator. Indeed, we have developed and continue to develop a tool called the framework for analyzing or reviewing racism complaints. So we will review various policies and initiatives within the government with a view to improving handling of this, whether these be grievances policies, in order to allow government organizations to better deal with racism. And we have a direct contact with the Human Rights Commission to help them continue to combat racism within organizations and within the context of these efforts. So we will continue to share any progress made with you. Thank you.
Senator Pate. Thank you very much, and thank you to all of you for being here and for your appearances in the past as well. I know that you've made many incredible recommendations about disaggregated data, about policy changes. I'd be very interested in the framework that you just discussed. If you haven't already shared it, and I apologize, I'm subbing for someone, so if you've already shared it, I will defer to that you've already done it. If you haven't, if you could share that with us, as well as any other recommendations you've made to other departments about this. While none of us, I believe, would hold any brief for any individual or organization by omission or commission contributing to anti-Black racism. I am one of a group that I think worries that some of the approach right now focusing on the Canadian Human Rights Commission and maybe also an attempt to get rid of some of the protections, albeit that need to be absolutely corrected, that do exist right now. I'm interested in whether you've made any recommendations that have not been followed by the Canadian Human Rights Commission, and I'd like to know what those are. I'd also be interested in what other recommendations you've made to government about including the anti-racism strategy. I'm interested in the particularly, and probably it won't surprise you, given my history in what's being proposed in terms of the justice strategy. My fear is that knowing what's happened with some of the Indigenous justice strategy, it's merely an indigenizing, a performative approach rather than a decolonizing or anti-racist approach that's been taken there. If there is anything that this committee could recommend that would assist your work in that regard. And finally, and I apologize, it's so many questions, but I know we're at the end. If there is any downside to the recommendation that my colleague Senator Arnott asked about moving this to a Privy Council position, if you're comfortable raising that, if there's a downside. If not, we can just leave it as is. But many of us are concerned about seeing anti-racism work writ large be raised to a much higher bar and priority, not just by this government, but within Canada. So I apologize that I know those are broad sweeping questions and comments, but if you any contribution to that would be gratefully received.
Thank you, Senator, for the questions. I hope I remembered them all. Let me start by saying that we are aware of the decision that was made in the policy grievance. and really when it comes to sort of the workplace and the federal public service workforce, when it comes to the anti-racism strategy, it's more of an external facing strategy. So it's more about the Canadian society. So it's really our colleagues at Treasury Board that, as Carol had mentioned in her speech, had offered to provide support to the CHRC as they go through how to implement changes following that policy grievance. So nothing in particular for us on that particular point. I will sidestep the downsides on their machinery question, but I will say that, in the last budget, there was an announcement made that there would be a small office or team at the Privy Council office as well, looking at anti-racism, equity, diversity, and inclusion. And so we look forward to seeing how we can work together with that office. And as Carol had mentioned, from an internal public service perspective, the clerk call to action has been a very strong instrument to incite change and to motivate and leaders and hold leaders accountable for making changes in terms of anti-racism and diversity and equity. In terms of our support to other government departments, I'll turn to my colleague Peter to sort of outline a few of those areas where we've worked with departments.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Senator. So what I'd say is that in the slew of documents we will be sending to the committee, one will be the report on the experience of Black youth with the youth criminal justice system, and you'll see listed several pretty robust recommendations that are coming directly from young people, their families, and organizations that support Black youth who have experience with the youth criminal justice system.
Time for this really quick one, brief one, and brief answers, please.
How much, I don't know if you can share, how robust was the interest of the government in looking at completely non-carceral, non-criminalizing components as opposed to the restorative types of approaches, if I can put it that way?
Right. So what I can say is that discussion, a very dynamic and robust discussion, is happening within government about the best approach to tackling the overrepresentation of people of African descent within federal penitentiaries. And in the context of developing Canada's Black justice strategy. So you'll be able to see that approach once the strategy is launched.
Thank you. I will forego asking a question. So no, it's Senator Bernard, so you can ask a question.
No, it's fine, Chair.
No, it's fine, Senator Bernard. Please.
In all of that, I think I forgot my question. Oh, yes, okay. So my apologies. One of the things we've heard from a number of witnesses is that this isn't, the anti-Black racism is not an issue that's solely related to the Canadian Human Rights Commission. It's across the public service. It's across Canadian society. But if we look specifically at the public service, can you offer any comment in terms of your thoughts about that? About what we're hearing from witnesses, that the anti-Black racism is quite rampant. And maybe we'll start with the Treasury Board, because that would be one of those public service departments, right?
So can I just add, my question was very similar to the lines, because in 2017, Black civil servants who were working on a mental health program at the Treasury Board were themselves subjected to, to help colleagues cope with racism, was themselves subjected to racism. So like you said, it's across the board. So I asked my question to Senator Bernard.
Question. I think there are two components to the answer to that question. The first is in relation to the work that I am asked to do with respect to the grievance processes and the oversight and the role the Treasury Board plays as an employer when something has occurred, and ensuring that employees have access to a robust and equitable recourse mechanism in order to have their realities heard. The grievance process, as I indicated in my opening remarks, offer different types of recourses for those employees and the bargaining agents as well to support them through that, up to and including third-party independent adjudication under the representation of their bargaining agents. The second portion of your question is under the policy arm of the Treasury Board to guide departments in fulfilling their requirements. And I think that as my colleagues have indicated earlier, there's a significant amount of work that's already been done. There's a number of different programs have been launched, especially in the last few years, as a response to the clerk's call to action, but as well as a response to the information, to the information that we're now gathering because of the collection of disaggregated data at a level that we have not had the opportunity to benefit from yet. And so in that context, I think that we are arming ourselves and equipping ourselves through the consultations that are happening, through the various programs that are happening across the public service, and in relation to people management at Treasury Board itself, to be able to set the foundation to ensure an equitable, a diverse, and inclusive workplace for everybody.
This particular grievance took almost 3 years to reach a decision. Is that a natural length of time that a grievance of this nature would take? Because it seems like a long time. And I'm thinking particularly of the people who were directly involved, but also those who are witnessing.
Yeah.
That's a long time.
It was a long time. So the grievance itself was filed initially in the fall of 2020. And initially, the unions did agree to hold their grievances in abeyance in order that they could receive and review certain information from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. So there was a certain lag at the outset in order to collect the correct amount of information. And this did take some time. Additionally, it did take some time for us to receive the submissions from both the bargaining agents and the Canadian Human Rights Commission. And scheduling the hearings in the middle of the pandemic was quite difficult as well. There were 2 separate hearing dates, one in the fall of 22 and another in the spring of, or in the winter of 2023 before my decision was rendered. So that accounts for at least part of the delays in this particular case.
And how does that timeline compare to a typical grievance of this nature?
It's an interesting question. To be honest with you, this is the first time that Treasury Board Secretariat as employer has been seized with a policy grievance with the type of allegations that we've seen. Now, that is not to say that there have not been individual grievances or other types of grievances, but this was a first situation for the scope and breadth of the allegations that were being alleged. And it was also the first time that 3 separate bargaining agents filed grievances at the same time. Normally, it's an allegation with respect to a single. So that added to the complexity of the situation as well.
I want to take this opportunity to thank our witnesses. We greatly appreciate the help that you have given us as we move forward with this important study. And I speak for all the senators that your assistance is greatly appreciated. And senators, I want to thank you for, we had indicated that we might finish at 7, but we didn't because there were so many questions. So I want to thank you for your patience too. Colleagues, the meeting is adjourned.
An internal review has found that Canada's human rights watchdog discriminated against its own employees. Well, tonight, some of them are speaking exclusively to David Thurton about the racism they experienced.
I had never had the privilege.
Bernadeth Betchi wants the public to know about the hurt she and other Black civil servants endured.
Sadness, anger, exhaustion. Having to prove that Black bodies are worthy of human is exhausting.
Betchi worked at the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the arm's-length federal body that's supposed to investigate discrimination.
I would describe the Canadian Human Rights Commission, the environment, the workplace, as toxic, poisonous. It has affected my mental and physical well-being and health, and I'm not the only one.
Betchi and 8 others filed a complaint alleging discriminatory practices, including that race-based complaints were often dismissed by all white investigative teams, that when she and her colleagues spoke up, colleagues demeaned them, and that black employees were excluded in career advancement. The federal government's human resource arm agreed the commission did discriminate against its own workers.
If the commission itself is guilty of discriminatory practices, really what chance do Canadians have to rely on the commission to protect them from discriminatory practices?
I don't recommend anyone that is black, racialized, or again, from any religious minority group to file a complaint at the Canadian Human Rights Commission.
That's why Betchi wants a third-party investigation by someone experienced in anti-black racism.
They need to come and investigate anti-black racism within the commission.
In a statement, the commission says it accepts the findings. It says it's committed to anti-racism, but won't comment further because the matter is before mediation. Justice Minister David Lametti says the findings are disappointing and concerning. David Thurton, CBC News, Ottawa.